black folks like this think they belong in court?" the officer snarled through his teeth. He didn't ask for an ID. Didn't wait for an explanation. He shoved her hard against the wall and handcuffed her in front of dozens of onlookers. He screamed in her face as if it were some natural right granted by the color of his skin. But what he couldn't have imagined was this. The woman he had just humiliated was the newly appointed police chief, his direct superior, sworn in just yesterday. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was justice slapping the very man who dared to speak in its name. What state do you live in? Does the system do this where you are? Under the cold white lighting from the ceiling, the trial began like any other day. The scent of old paper, the dry screech of wooden chairs, and the hardened faces of those who'd stood and sat down too many times, waiting for a verdict just enough to calm the crowd, even if only temporarily. But today, something felt off. No one said it aloud, yet nearly everyone sensed it. A black woman, thin but far from frail, walked into the courtroom with even steps. Neither fast nor slow enough to make anyone wait. She wore a minimalist black suit, a white shirt buttoned all the way up, holding a plain folder in her left arm, and a worn brown leather-strapped watch on her right wrist. Aged, but untarnished. No badge, no insignia, no employee card, no name tag. She was simply a woman with no one there to receive her, no one guiding her to a seat, and no one daring to ask what she was doing there. Rick Talbert, a seasoned sergeant with 19 years on the force, was the first to notice, not because she looked unfamiliar, but because she didn't try to be less so. She didn't avoid eye contact, nor did she care that she had become the center of every gaze. Rick looked her up and down, glanced at the empty seat at the end of the row near the restroom, a place no one wanted unless they had no choice. She looked toward the public seating area where victims' families or the press typically sat. Rick stepped into her path as she approached. No one stood nearby, but everyone saw the way he stopped directly in front of her, close enough to create a distance that didn't need words. He didn't ask, didn't smile, didn't show hostility, just paused long enough to force someone to walk around him or bow their head in apology for choosing the wrong path. She didn't bow, didn't go around. She stood her ground. Rick leaned in slightly, stepping closer, pretending not to notice her presence, then brushed past, his shoulder grazing hers, a slight touch as if marking territory, like saying, "This is my spot." Right after, he pulled a tissue from his breast pocket and wiped his shoulder with a deliberate flick. The motion lasted less than 2 seconds, but was enough for a young officer nearby to raise an eyebrow. Rick ignored it. He was used to people staying silent. When she reached the row, her assigned seat, clearly printed on the invitation, had been moved. The small sign that once read "Guest Observer" was replaced with a blank card placed at the back row, against the wall, beside the women's restroom and near the records archive. The faint smell of chlorine drifted through a half-open door. A court employee said loudly, "No one misplaced that sign." No one corrected it. No one met her eyes. She walked to that seat without complaint or request. She sat, opened the folder, and read as if the seat didn't matter. Rick glanced over, his eyes full of nothing but contempt. He turned to a familiar lieutenant beside him and muttered, just loud enough, "This kind gets to sit in on hearings too?" The words rolled off like a comment on the weather. The lieutenant shrugged and smirked. Others didn't laugh, but no one objected either. That silence was confirmation. In the courtroom of justice, not everyone believed every person had a right to be there. A security camera overhead swept across the hallway. The image wasn't clear, but it caught the exact moment Rick rolled his eyes and turned his head, with that signature smirk, half grin, half sneer. He didn't know he was being recorded. Or if he did, he didn't care. Rick Talbert had done this too many times without anyone ever asking. To him, injustice wasn't a problem as long as the person wasn't his friend, didn't look like him, and most importantly, didn't dare speak up, then everything was fine. The trial began after a 15-minute delay. The white judge tapped the gavel, its sound soft but cold. Charges were read. A police officer accused of excessive force against an unarmed black youth. Celeste sat there, unmoving, no notes. She simply looked toward the witness stand. A young man in a light blue shirt sat stiffly, fingers interlocked, eyes darting nervously toward the three uniformed officers in the front row, Rick seated in the middle. Rick paid no attention to the witness. He was watching the woman at the back, not to figure out who she was, but to confirm she was nobody, an unnamed presence, voiceless, powerless, a scratch on the wooden courtroom walls, and the old scent of uniform steeped in outdated authority. From the witness stand, the defense attorney began his argument. For a moment, Rick's eyes fell back on her face. He saw she wasn't writing anything, wasn't looking at him either. That bothered him. He was used to people either lowering their eyes or glaring in some loud, rebellious way. Easy to crush, but she did nothing, just sat there, breathing steadily, staring ahead in silence. So silent it felt like she was reflecting him back at himself. A report was read aloud on repeated patterns of excessive force by officers, particularly in the precinct Rick had once led. Celeste turned a page. The paper's rustle sliced into Rick's ears like a knife. He turned his face away, then remembered the cameras. Straightening up, he folded his arms, adjusted his posture, and then glanced back to the end of the room. She still didn't look at him, and that, more than anything, made him want to scream. But the trial had just begun, and Rick Talbert didn't yet know that the name he didn't bother asking today would soon be the last name he ever wanted to hear. The trial continued, but the chill in the room no longer came from the air conditioner. It came from the space no one dared name, the silence of a black woman deemed unworthy of being there, but who sat anyway. Like a question, no one had the courage to answer. No one in the courtroom said anything further. But when Celeste rose from her seat, the entire atmosphere seemed to draw back a step. Each of her footsteps echoed across the granite floor without sound, yet pulled eyes toward her as if tethered by an invisible thread. It was a long corridor, sterile white, cold, where the sound of footsteps typically belonged only to those sanctioned to speak. There, Rick was already waiting, leaning casually against the wall near the witness break room, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a paper coffee cup, eyes locked on her silhouette like a lazy predator that had yet to be satisfied. As she drew near, he flashed a crooked smile, not one of greeting, but one meant to slice. "Assistant," Rick said, the word sharp like a slap to the face. No name, no introduction, just a single term, thrown out like he was summoning someone to fetch coffee or carry files during a morning briefing. She stopped. Her gaze betrayed neither surprise nor hurt. Only a stillness settled at the bottom of her eyes like a stream long accustomed to flowing against the current. He scanned her from head to toe, his stare unhidden, like a buyer inspecting merchandise not yet tagged at auction. A sharp whistle followed, piercing like a blade slicing past her ear. "I wonder if you even have a real invitation." The hallway wasn't crowded, but just full enough for that comment to bounce off the stone walls and land clearly in the minds of nearby onlookers. A young officer near the walled neck phone paused his report mid-sentence. A security staffer quietly turned away, pretending to adjust his belt. Rick didn't need allies, nor anyone to laugh along. He was too used to the solitude of someone who believed he always stood on the right side of the law, so much so that every arrogant remark he made felt to him like a form of justice, judging others through the coarse lens of his own belief. Celeste didn't answer. She stepped forward, her eyes grazing over him without stopping. But Rick raised his hand, pointing to the right. "Guest seating's that way. This isn't staff territory," he said in the tone of someone correcting a stray dog. She halted, not turning fully, just angling herself slightly, eyes fixed on the glass doors at the end of the corridor, where sunlight spilled in like a quiet reminder that the world still had a sun, even if, inside this place, it was blocked by the narrow stares of men like Rick. She pulled a firm card from her coat pocket, not to show him, but to glance at it herself. The row was printed clearly. Seat B4, fourth row on the left, right within the area reserved for senior officers and strategic advisors. She looked up again. This time her eyes met Rick's, not with heat, not with blades. just clarity. Like a nod to a poisonous breeze, she walked on. But as she neared the seating area, a female staffer in a gray vest stepped in front of her. "Sorry, this section is for senior command and internal personnel only," the woman said quickly, her eyes fixed on the guest pass Celeste was holding. Celeste offered her invitation. The staffer skimmed it, then pressed her lips together. "I think there's been a miscommunication. Guest observers are supposed to sit in the outer row." Her voice was timid, but her eyes seemed coached, like someone had warned her ahead of time. "If you see that woman, push her out." No protest, no questions. Celeste turned and walked on her own toward the outer row, yet each step she took seemed to carve into the hallway floor, leaving behind invisible cracks in an air already chilled. Rick returned to his original spot near the courtroom door, sipped from a cup of cold coffee, and turned to a nearby lieutenant. "See, everyone thinks they belong here just 'cause they're holding a piece of paper." The lieutenant smirked, but something in his eyes kept that smirk from lingering. An elderly lawyer with a mess of white hair rolled a file case past them, pausing for about 3 seconds to glance at Celeste being pushed outward. He shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath as he walked away. "I thought we were past this." The word struck the silent wall, building itself around her, not to save, but to confirm. This injustice wasn't new. Rick stood there like a man who had reclaimed dominion over space, not for justice, not for rank, but simply because he believed men like him should hold the keys to every door in this building. Celeste took a seat against the wall, a lone black woman in the whitewashed hallway of justice. No one asked her name, no one introduced her, no one needed to know where she came from. And to Rick, that was a quiet victory. Celeste opened the file folder on her lap. The first page was an organizational chart of the city's police department. She took a blue highlighter and drew a line under one name. Slowly, without hesitation, no one saw it. But had someone turned around, they might have realized silence does not mean powerlessness. And composure, sometimes, is the final preparation before the fiercest counterstrike. The words on the file were still unfinished when Celeste gently closed the folder, her gaze as still as a winter lake. But that lake was not calm. It was only hiding the undercurrents, waiting for the wind. She stood up, letting her eyes drift across the hallway, where the crowd had begun to disperse in preparation for the closed-door session between relevant parties. The soft click of shoes on marble didn't echo loudly, but it was unmistakable. Everything in this building seemed designed to preserve order, but that very order had become the perfect excuse for tiny injustices to trickle through every corner of the hallway, every glance, every breath. And Rick Talbert was still standing there, this time not pretending to go anywhere, not bothering to mask his demeanor. He waited, not to talk, but to assert that no matter how far she walked, this space still belonged to him. Celeste approached. No hesitation, no avoidance. But just under 3 steps from him, Rick began to move, not hurried, not slow, but timed perfectly to block her path. He stepped across, holding a stack of papers, though not reading them. His eyes locked onto her face, a silent declaration of war. He stood firm, his shoulders wide enough to fully obstruct the way through, feet braced as if ready to hold that position until she chose to turn back. She didn't stop, just slowed her pace, standing close enough that both could hear each other's breath. Rick gave a soft chuckle, as if savoring background music only he could hear. Then suddenly he raised his hand and touched the folder she was holding. No permission, no explanation, no reason except the self-appointed authority of a man too used to controlling everything in front of him. His dry fingers rested on the edge of the folder, as if ready to flip a page, or at least prove that he had the right to touch whatever he pleased. Celeste didn't flinch. Her eyes held steady, lips pressed tight, her face unwavering, as if that very silence was the sharpest defense of all. Rick let go of the page edge, curled his lip, and hissed through his teeth. "I don't take orders from your kind." Each word came out slow, deliberate, like he wanted every syllable to carve itself into her skin, not as a warning, but as a blade already honed. A young officer carrying a file walked by and saw the entire scene. He stopped mid-step, his expression uncertain, then bowed his head as if searching for something in his pocket. His hand clenched briefly, then relaxed again. No one said a word, and that was the real sting, the silence of those who saw the wrong but feared the price of being right. Celeste didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, eyes lowering to the folder as if rereading a line of internal protocol, then stepped around Rick without offering a word of apology. Rick moved back by half a step, not to make way, but to avoid being touched by her. The disgust in his eyes was now plain. But beneath that disgust was a flicker of confusion so subtle even he hadn't recognized it yet. Why didn't she react? He turned, watching her walk away, lips pressed tight, not with anger, but with bitterness, because he had struck, and she hadn't even bothered to guard, as if the blow wasn't worthy of being called a blow. Celeste kept walking, no glance back, no sigh, no search for allies. The hallway before her opened not because anyone stepped aside, but because she never stopped to wait for anyone to. She walked as if no one had ever tried to block her, and behind her Rick Talbot stood watching, realizing for the first time he had thrown a punch, but it left no mark. Not because it was weak, but because his opponent was too deep to be scratched by a dull blade. She continued walking, but not far. The hallway air was still cold, but the hand that had just grazed the folder in her arms didn't withdraw. Instead, it shifted quickly, rudely, unannounced, and invasively. Rick reached down and grabbed the strap of her bag, yanking it toward him. The move wasn't violent enough to injure, but it created a visible imbalance in the space. A white man in a faded police uniform, gripping the bag of a black woman without asking, and without hiding his intent. "Just checking, fake invites are easy to make," Rick muttered, his voice hissing with the condescension of someone who believed the right to inspect without reason came built into the nameplate pinned to his chest. No one around intervened. People either quickened their steps or turned away. A few glanced, then quickly looked elsewhere, as if staring too long at the truth was, itself, a dangerous act. Celeste did not shift position. She didn't yank the bag back, didn't swat his hand away. Her hand remained on the strap, firm enough not to be pulled, but not aggressive enough to spark outright conflict. Her gaze lifted. It was not fierce, nor was it submissive. It was the look of someone who had taken note. A precise, unwavering record like ink stamped permanently onto paper, needing no repetition. "You should be grateful I haven't called security," Rick added, accompanied by a faint nasal laugh, as if what he had just done was some form of mercy she should appreciate it. The words weren't thrown like a killing blow, but more like a small cut, just deep enough to draw blood, but not deep enough to get the attacker caught. Celeste tilted her head slightly. No words, no response. But for a split second, Rick could see something shift in her eyes. Not fear, not anger. A quiet movement of recognition. She was registering something, not resisting it. He let go of the strap, though not out of guilt. Perhaps just bored with a search that yielded nothing. Or perhaps unable to bear the gaze that didn't push back. It made him feel like he was speaking to something beyond his ability to command. He adjusted his collar, turned away, just in time to miss the woman standing quietly at the end of the hall, near the elevator, a middle-aged clerk pulling out her phone, silently, raising it and pressing the capture button. There was no click, no flash, just a soft tap, and the frame froze at the exact moment Rick pulled his hand back from Celeste's strap, his eyes still narrowed in mockery, and her face still motionless, like a statue that didn't need words to demand attention. Celeste took out her phone, a simple black matte device, no sparkly case, no dangling charms. She opened the voice recording app and slid her finger across the screen. No need to look. Her hands knew the motion, like she'd done it hundreds of times. She didn't raise the phone, as if confronting someone. She simply kept it in her palm, her thumb pressing the record button as it ran. Rick's voice still echoed through the hallway. Words like fake, invite, should be grateful, I didn't call security. Each one captured, syllable by syllable, in a space no longer anonymous. Rick didn't notice. He had turned away, speaking to someone at the far end of the hallway in a voice louder than usual, the kind of voice used by men who still believed they controlled the stage. But Celeste didn't need a stage. She only needed data. A few seconds later, she stopped the recording, saved it under a short full name. 03_hallway_pull. She said nothing, looked at no one, simply returned to her seat, opened the folder again, and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. But something had. A hand had grabbed. A threat had been spoken. An image had been captured. A voice had been recorded. And a gaze, not angry, not resistant, had remembered. Not for revenge, but to wait. To wait for the moment when silence is allowed to speak. And then each detail would surface like a painting assembled from fragments of disgust. Each touch, each word, each glance, not gone, merely waiting to take its rightful place in the reversal of the justice scale. She sat still in the row against the wall, the folder in her hands like a magnet for eyes. Yet no one dared ask what she was reading. No one dared, but neither could they look away. Everyone sensed something was building, the compressed air of an explosion yet to make a sound. Outside, the courtroom doors flung open. Inside, white light poured over the wooden brown benches, and each step that echoed across the floor struck like the final count before collapse. Rick walked in, but his gait was no longer that of a man in control. It jittered, twitched, like someone who knew his grip was slipping. He saw her, instantly, no need to scan the room. And what unraveled him wasn't her appearance. It was her persistence. She was still there, not withdrawn, not softened, not dodging his stare. She lifted her head, her gaze colder than the fluorescent light that flooded the chamber. But she said nothing. Once again, it was her silence that broke his control. Rick advanced. No warning, no permission. He swung his arm and slammed her shoulder. A violent shove so rough that the folder in Celeste's hands flew to the ground. Papers scattering like shredded leaves in a storm. The air froze for a second. Every eye turned toward them. Some people gasped, as if punched in the chest. He roared, saliva spraying mid-shout like shrapnel. "I don't take orders from someone not in uniform and without the right skin color." Each word landed like a slash. No knives, no guns, just venom and warped conviction. The room thickened. A man from the public seating row pulled out his phone, held it up, his hand trembling slightly but keeping focus. Another shouted, "Put that away! This isn't a zoo!" But the camera kept rolling, and the video kept recording. Every frame, every scream, every glance, preserved not for now, but for what would follow. Celeste bent down, slowly, unrushed. She picked up each paper as if nothing warranted haste. That act, without response, without rebuttal, was itself a reverse slap, harder than any punch. Rick looked down, waiting for a reaction, but there was none. No glare, no words, not even hate, just a void, so absolute it erased him, and that was what shook him most. Celeste stacked the papers again, sat upright, smoothed her blouse, then rested her hands on her lap. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Not one colleague stepped forward, but the entire courtroom, all eyes now fixed on him, became a quiet array of needles, piercing the dignity of a man who had just exposed himself. Rick exhaled, stepped back, but found no footing. At the far end of the room, the red camera light blinked. He didn't notice, or didn't want to. That shove, that scream, that hit, they were all recorded now. But Celeste knew, and she didn't need confirmation, because true justice does not need noise. It only needs one deep enough impact. And today, Rick had delivered it with his own hands. What Rick didn't expect was this, that the shove wasn't the beginning of the case, but the final bell tolling the end of the very role he held. As Celeste returned to her seat, posture straight, movements composed as always, the courtroom doors opened once again. A stiff footstep struck the tiled floor. Judge Roderick Manning, known for his cold impartiality, stepped forward, holding an updated file from the clerk's desk. He looked across a room frozen by one man's actions, then set the file down and tapped the bench gently, his voice low but clear. "If the chief would like a recess, we will pause the hearing." The courtroom shattered, not with sound, but with synchronized stares. Rick's brow tightened, his back locked up, as though slapped by a force he couldn't see. He turned toward Celeste, still seated, both hands resting on her knees as if no one had touched her. as if no folder had hit the floor, as if no racist outburst had ever echoed. Calmly, she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small black object, a leather wallet, no badge on the outside. She opened it, rotated it forward, no need to raise it high, no need to speak loudly, no need to reaffirm anything. Inside the wallet, a silver-edged ID card reflected the room's light, printed clearly. Chief of Police, Celeste Monroe. Top left corner, an ID photo, formal and direct, her gaze piercing every false assumption the system ever built. She closed the wallet gently and, for the first time, spoke, not to accuse, not to challenge, but simply to state a verifiable fact. Chief Celeste Monroe. I'm here today just to observe, just one sentence. But it popped the balloon of hollow authority Rick had clung to for so long. He didn't step back, didn't move forward. He just stopped breathing. His hand trembled slightly. A pen clipped to his shirt pocket fell, clinking against the courtroom floor like metal echoing through a cathedral. He didn't bend to pick it up, because if he did, he feared he might never rise again, not under the weight of every gaze now on him. They were no longer a look of camaraderie, no longer teammates, no longer the silent complicity he had always counted on. These were eyes of reckoning, realizing that all this time they had let a man like this walk among them, laugh among them, degrade others in their presence. And now there were no excuses left for their silence. A female clerk stood first. Not to leave, but because sitting any longer had become impossible. A middle-aged man behind her removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, not from emotion, but disbelief that what had just happened was real. Phones were being pocketed, not because anyone had asked, but because no one wanted to stain this moment with shallow curiosity. In a single collective exhale, the courtroom, once bowed before Rick's worn-out uniform, now rose, not for him, but for the woman who remained seated, steady as a monument to a new era. Rick was rooted. He wanted to retreat, but there was no exit for a man who had unveiled himself under full light. The words he'd spat, "Don't take orders from someone not in uniform and without the right color," now echoed back like a locked vault of shame. No one repeated them, yet everyone remembered. No one spoke, but every stare carried a sentence heavier than any legal verdict. His career, his honor, his armor of authority. It wasn't undone by a bullet. It was erased by a single, quiet sentence. "I'm just here to observe." Celeste stood, not quickly, not defiantly. She simply stood, and the whole room seemed to lean toward her. She needed no more words, no threats, no immediate action. She only needed them to see what they had never dared to face, an undeniable truth, a living presence once dismissed as lesser, now the one holding the final card. And she wasn't using it for vengeance. She used it to exist, with the composure of someone who knew the coming earthquake didn't rise from rage, but from silent authority. Rick swallowed hard. His throat was dry as desert dust in July. He glanced toward the judge, then down at the floor where the pen still lay, the lone evidence of a free fall he never saw coming. Everything had come undone, not because she screamed, not because she accused, but because she let the truth do its work. And truth, when unveiled at the right moment, is the most violent thing a broken system will ever face. Celeste turned to the judge and gave a slight nod. "I'm fine, the hearing can continue." That line, short, sufficient, made the judge lean back in his chair, as if shedding a silent weight carried over 2 decades of service he had never named aloud, that sometimes those in power must relearn how to listen. And the one who forced the whole system to listen today was not a prosecutor, not a judge, not a politician, but a black woman was once labeled a guest in her own house. Celeste sat back down, reopened her folder. Her eyes were no longer those of an observer. They were the eyes of someone holding power, yet choosing silence, not out of helplessness, but because the strongest one in the room is the one who no longer needs to prove it. Rick still stood there, or rather, had no idea what else to do but stand, in a room whose lights had shifted. They no longer shone for him. No longer because of him. From this moment forward, the light was off, not on her, but on him. And when the light goes out, it's not darkness that takes over. It's truth, bare, unshouted, capable of tearing down an entire illusion built from years of pride. He had only one option left: silence. And this time, silence was no longer a weapon. It was a sentence. She said only one sentence, but its weight was enough to make the entire system rise to its feet. Then she sat down again, reopened the file on the table, as if nothing had just happened. But the truth is, everything began at that moment. From the instant the ID card was pulled out, the air cracked like glass, stretched to its limit, and this time, the fracture didn't stop inside the courtroom. It spilled out, crept onto the internet, slammed into the doors of every newsroom, erupted like fire, catching the fumes of a gas layer that had been smoldering for decades. Less than 1 hour later, the video of Rick shoving Celeste spread across all social media platforms. Just one push, one shouted sentence, "I don't take orders from someone out of uniform and the wrong color," was all it took for the online world to turn him into the face of everything rotten the system had tried to cover with a veil. But that wave was only the overture, because when a force tries to drown someone in silence, it also digs its own grave with secrets it never buried deep enough. An old video, assumed to have been deleted, resurfaced from the depths of social media like a corpse floating up in a lake. Rick, in an internal meeting 3 years ago, was seen yelling into the face of a young female officer, "If you're not going to cooperate, maybe you should go back to the ghetto where you learned that rude tone." The girl in the video was the first black female lieutenant ever appointed to the Internal Affairs Unit at the time, and she was also the one who filed for a transfer just 6 weeks later. Netizens found her in less than 2 hours. She is now an advisor for a human rights organization and has confirmed, through her attorney, the voice in the video is Rick Talbert's. On Twitter, the hashtag #RickTalbert outshot straight to the top 3 trending topics overnight. But what turned this from outrage to shock didn't come from the public. It came from within the police force itself, where loyalty and cover-ups had long been the norm. A young officer, only 3 years on the job, wrote a 7-paragraph internal letter, not published publicly but leaked the next morning. In the letter, he wrote, "I saw everything, and I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, but because I was afraid, and my fear enabled wrongdoing. I am sorry, not just to Mrs. Monroe, but to myself, for not doing the right thing when it mattered most." The letter had no signature, but it carried more explosive power than 100 op-eds, because it was a confession from inside the system, and a confession like that was the only thing capable of shaking collective awareness. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the city council convened an emergency meeting, not due to public pressure, but because major donors had started emailing with questions. Is this really the image the city wants its name attached to? One female councilwoman, who had previously opposed Celeste's appointment on the grounds of insufficient seniority, was found deleting a string of old posts from her personal page. A quiet race had begun among the politicians. Who would be the first to publicly align with Celeste, just to avoid being seen as someone who turned too late? Meanwhile, TV stations lined up for interviews. CNN wanted exclusive rights to an independent dialogue. MSNBC proposed a panel with black feminist activists. Fox News went as far as sending a full delegation to the police chief's office, but all received the same one-line reply: "I work, not perform." Celeste did not appear on screen, did not make statements, did not call the press. She arrived at the office on time and processed each file one by one as if the storm outside had nothing to do with her. But it was precisely that silence that made the entire city unable to look away. Because no one stays that silent under attack unless they know the truth is speaking on their behalf. In the hallway on the 3rd floor of headquarters, where on most days there was only the sound of footsteps and papers turning, the air was now thick with whispers. A veteran officer walked past Celeste's office, paused for a few seconds, then moved on. No knock, no greeting, but the doubt once worn across his face was gone. In its place was acceptance, not reluctant, but inevitable. Rick vanished from social media. His internal account was suspended. The internal review of his conduct was moved up by 3 weeks. His apartment, once lined with commendations and plaques of honor, was now under round-the-clock siege by reporters. But no one waited for a statement from him. They were only waiting to see how the system would handle a man who once represented it, now that the woman he had targeted was overseeing the entire process, and Celeste, still sitting at her desk, turned page after page, not of just any file, but the file of Rick Talbert himself, just been retrieved from the old archival system. The folder's cover was still stained with coffee rings, and the papers inside still carried the musty smell of things hidden too long in sealed drawers. She picked up a pen and wrote the first line, "Re-examine all complaints from the past 10 years. She didn't underline it. She didn't add an exclamation mark. Because justice, once set in motion, needs no dramatics, only precision. And this time, it was precise, down to the last detail. The next morning, the second-floor conference room of police headquarters, a space usually reserved for brief tactical discussions and half-hearted handshakes, was locked early. No reporters, no secretaries, no recordings, internal staff only those in uniform. But the atmosphere felt no different from a silent hearing, where truth needed no microphone, only eyes. Rick arrived 3 minutes late. 3 minutes isn't long, but in that room, it cut like a blade across the arrogance that was no longer protected. No one asked why. No one mentioned the time. The door closed behind him and not a single person stood up. No greetings, no shared glances, only the scraping sound of his own chair echoed. Isolated and out of place among 28 others. Celeste was already seated. No nameplate, no elevated chair, no need to claim the head of the table. She sat in the center, but was clearly the focal point. In front of her lay a red-covered file folder. Beside it, the list titled Behavioral Evaluation Past 6 Months, a document that used to be auto-signed by her predecessor. But today she read out each name, clearly, steadily, with no rush, skipping no one. And then, on the 11th name, she paused for exactly half a beat, just 1 second, then continued, Officer Rick Talbert. No one spoke. Rick shifted slightly, but not enough to remove himself from focus. He knew, this time, the name wasn't just a label, it was a silent indictment. Celeste didn't look at him. She looked down at the paper, then tapped her pen lightly on the table. I propose a full-scale reevaluation process, based on the old internal records. All dismissed complaints will be transferred directly to the External Review Board. Her voice was not loud, but each word carried its own weight, growing heavier with each breath, drawn by those in the room. She didn't need to emphasize any one, but everyone knew one of the files would be Rick's. And this time, no one stood at the door to block the review from proceeding. An older officer, his hair gray, his rank already retired, stood up mid-meeting. He scanned the room, then fixed his gaze on Rick, his voice not raised, but each word sharp as a blade. What if that woman had been my wife, Rick? It wasn't a question. It was raw, a slap in the face of a mindset that believed disrespect could be justified by position or tenure. Rick gave no answer. He lowered his head. But in that room, no one missed his expression. His face not flushed with shame, but pale from being stripped bare among his own. The meeting did not drag on. Celeste did not punish. Knotts did not conclude, did not pass judgment. She merely laid out the procedure, step by step, task by task, deadline by deadline. There was no talk of paying the price, no mention of strict disciplinary measures, only a system beginning to realign. Before leaving the room, she reached out and opened the red file. She said nothing, just placed it at the center of the table, where everyone could see. The cover read in bold, Ethics Evaluation, UM, Internal Unit. Below the title, a temporary signature was already there, but the space for the confirmation signature remained blank. Celeste didn't hand it to anyone. She left it there, a final message. From now on, nothing would be automatic. Rick rose slowly, as if every step he took had become a piece of evidence. No one stopped him, but no one saw him off either. When the door closed behind him, the room did not feel lighter. It merely began to breathe again after daring to confront the stench that had been hidden beneath the carpet for too long. As for Celeste, she didn't raise her head, continuing to take notes on the next page. She didn't flex. She didn't gloat. Because this wasn't a punishment. This was a transfusion, quiet, but cutting to the bone. 3 days later, inside a carefully arranged studio lit with soft lighting and minimalist camera angles, Celeste Monroe appeared on national television for the first time since the entire incident erupted. No dramatic music, no opening montage, just a clean cut placing her face to face with the entire nation. The host, a veteran anchor known for his relentless interview style, sat across from her, hands interlaced, voice calm but eyes betraying a deep curiosity. "Chief Monroe, why didn't you respond at that moment? You didn't say a word? Didn't push back, when clearly many people expected you to do something?" Celeste sat still for a beat. She didn't adjust the microphone, didn't tap her fingers on the table. She simply looked directly into the interviewer's eyes and replied with a sentence so short it left no time to brace for its weight. "I stayed silent so he could say enough about himself." A hush blanketed the room, not because there wasn't a follow-up question, but because everyone in the studio crew and audience alike sensed that nothing more needed to be said. The host froze. His eyes blinked slowly. The nod that followed wasn't agreement. It was surrender to a logic that left no room for argument, a logic that made every justification seem foolish, and forced those who had once criticized Celeste for her silence to confront themselves. The clip was only 13 seconds long. No music, no editing, no transitions, but it spread faster than rally chants or fiery speeches. The caption beneath the clip, unaffiliated with the studio, was added by an anonymous user, "Coldest answer of the year." Within 6 hours, the video hit 1 million shares. Every other network began digging up her past interviews, but none surpassed the impact of one sentence that buried an entire flawed narrative. "I stayed silent so he could say enough about himself." On social media, legal and academic forums launched discussions on the concept of strategic silence. Several media professors analyze Celeste's response as a lesson in soft power, the kind that doesn't come from shouting, but from letting the opponent dig their own grave. Others quietly revise their earlier opinions, not by resharing the clip with notes that read, "Now I understand." And Rick, the man who once believed he was the center of every briefing, every hallway, every patrol, sat alone in his small 8th-floor apartment, his laptop still playing the 13-second clip. The lights in the room were off. Only the screen's glow lit his face, now devoid of confidence, wrinkled with the shame of hearing himself echoed back through someone else's lips. He held a coffee mug, old, no longer hot, no longer flavorful. His hands shook, not from cold, but because he now knew no one needed his explanation anymore. No one was waiting for an apology. No one sought him out to understand both sides, because the world had already seen enough, heard enough, and the scariest part wasn't what she had said. It was that she didn't need to say anything for the entire system to understand exactly who he was. The coffee mug shattered in his hand, not because he threw it, but because the grip tightened uncontrollably. Ceramic fragments were scattered across the floor, mingling with the sound of ragged breaths. Rick kept staring at the screen where Celeste, with no anger, no mockery, no revenge, simply existed, and let the world handle the rest. And in that moment, for the first time, Rick realized he didn't lose because she was stronger. He lost because she didn't need to win. She only needed to let the truth do its job. The rest he handled all by himself. On the 6th floor of police headquarters, the door to the Human Resources office closed for the 13th time in just 2 days. On the desk lay a stack of transfer requests, all from officers who had once served under Rick. No notice, no request for dialogue. One of them wrote the reason bluntly: "I don't believe in a reform driven by emotional reactions to media pressure." The application was concise, with no extra punctuation and no added explanation. But on the margin was a folded crease, clear hesitation before the signature. A younger officer, during the final internal meeting, had left a badge, removed from his own chest, on Rick's desk, without a letter, just placed beside a folder containing case notes from incidents never properly resolved under Rick's command. No one touched it, but the badge remained there the entire morning, a wordless accusation. Celeste received the first copy at 8:02 a.m. She skimmed through it, showing no emotion, just nodded at her secretary and asked for the remaining list to be printed. When the nearly 2-centimeter thick file was placed on her desk, she picked up a pen and signed each page. No questions, no callbacks, no delays. Each stroke of the pen landed like an order of deployment, fast, clean, without a single word to persuade anyone to stay. The atmosphere in the office seemed to be quiet, as if even the sheets of paper could feel the precise coldness too measured to resist. Downstairs, a group of cadets whispered about the previous night's closed-door meeting between Rick and the disciplinary board. A meeting leaked via a 2.5-minute audio clip in which Rick lost his temper, slammed the table, and demanded a reassessment of the accuser's credibility. Just 2.5 minutes, but the clip spread through the internal network like an outbreak. In the cafeteria the next morning, no one sat at his table. His meal tray was pushed to the far edge of the last table, beneath a half-lit bulb and a wheezing air conditioner struggling to swallow unsaid words. The janitor who cleaned the room after Rick left had left behind the mug he used, uncleaned, untouched. At the bottom was a folded slip of paper with bold printed words, "No one fears you anymore, only contempt remains." She didn't look up, didn't ask why, because true leadership doesn't cling to those who choose to leave by covering the truth with denial. They look forward to the part that still needs rebuilding. And rather than feeling hurt by the departure, she moved as if it were a natural filtration, the old system shedding itself. Meanwhile, in a corner of the administrative wing, Lieutenant Eliza Gomez, once sidelined by Rick from a supervisory role simply for lacking experience in managing men, sat staring blankly at a reinstatement letter. She had once stayed silent, once stepped back, once considered resignation. But that morning, Celeste had signed a temporary appointment order, restoring Eliza to the exact position she had been stripped of. Not because of pressure, but because she deserved it. On the document, Celeste wrote only, "We begin with those who were left behind." It was not a favor. It was how she rebuilt the system, using trust that had been stolen, now returned through action. Outside the office, a senior officer, once rebuked by Rick for lacking the discipline to lead, quietly stood, placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder as she stepped into the hallway, saying nothing, just nodding slowly. The way an older generation passes down belief. The air wasn't loud, but the feeling of restoration was so real that even those who had once witnessed Eliza's silence were now compelled to look back. That morning, a video began circulating on social media. A young officer, wearing dark sunglasses, removed his badge, threw it on the ground, and lit it on fire right in front of headquarters. The footage was shaky, filmed vertically, but unmistakable, flames catching, badge sizzling, the officer saying nothing but one short sentence. "This isn't my team anymore." Just 5 words, yet it spread like wildfire. Dozens of accounts reshared the clip, captioned, "A blaze for what stayed silent too long." In the comments, many former officers who had resigned in silence began to speak out, recounting internal investigations that were manipulated, times they were forced to sign reports Rick had pre-written. One wrote, "I used to think I was alone in that collapse. Today I know I was just the first to fall." At the same time, in the public reception area, a seemingly harmless exchange became the second spark. A cadet asked the front desk clerk whether Lieutenant Rick still held his position. The clerk, elderly and usually discreet, responded with a flat voice, "If he still has the title, he no longer has the face." The line was recorded by someone standing behind, the audio faint, but the burst of laughter that followed amplified it louder than any official notice. By noon, the quote had become a meme, paired with a photo of Rick walking across the parking lot, head down, shadows stretched long by the sun, captioned, "Consequences need no conviction." A brown envelope was delivered to Rick's desk from the equipment management office. Inside was no letter, only an access badge, punctured and stamped in red. Access suspended pending review. No one knocked, no one spoke. The messenger walked past like delivering a preordained package, no signature required. Rick opened it, his fingers freezing as they touched the edge of the card. Faint laughter from the common area outside echoed in, like from another world, a world no longer his. There were no curses, no thrown stones. People simply withdrew from the space he once occupied, leaving behind a void no authority could refill. And in that void, he began to understand it wasn't the chair he lost, it was his credibility, drained like blood flowing in reverse. In the cafeteria, the line for coffee moved as usual, but when Rick walked in, no one made space. No one turned around. The television screen in the corner replayed the clip of the officer burning his badge. The sound was low, but the spark of flame was sharp enough to chill the spine. Rick turned away, intending to grab a paper cup, when he noticed that his name tag, placed in front of the machine, had been crossed out, replaced with two messy, handwritten words. Not now. No one claimed responsibility. No one offered an explanation. But it was that very ambiguity that made it spread faster than any formal disciplinary decision. The story of a man who once sat at the center, now pushed to the edge, not by protest, not by blood, but simply by the way people chose not to look at him anymore. That same morning, a first-year cadet passed him in the lobby, and instead of greeting, silently pulled up his collar to cover the Academy logo, not out of fear, but to avoid even the chance of locking eyes with what once represented misplaced authority. That morning, a video began spreading on social media. A young officer, wearing dark sunglasses, removed his badge, threw it on the ground, and set it on fire in front of headquarters. The video was shaky, shot vertically, but unmistakable. Flame caught, badge sizzled, and the officer said nothing, except one short sentence: "This isn't my team anymore." It was expected to stir support, but within 60 minutes, the video received thousands of angry comments. Citizens reshared it with captions like a hammer's rebuttal. "If you can't handle a woman with principles, you should find another job." Veterans entered the comments bluntly, "Burning a badge doesn't make her weaker. It just shows who never deserved theirs." Within 3 hours, the account that posted the clip deleted all content, but the internet does not forget. That face to the one who burned the badge was now attached to the crumbling image of a fading old system. More than that, a screenshot of the officer bent down lighting the fire was turned into a sticker, posted across internal bulletin boards with a caption, "This isn't my team anymore, and that's why we're still standing." Some stuck it on their locker doors, as a reminder that what burned in that flame was what truly needed to be destroyed: fear, stubbornness, and the silence that had lasted too long. An independent newspaper even printed the photo on its cover with the headline, "Resistance doesn't need shouting, just the refusal to bow." On the third-floor break area, a large screen displayed the industry conference info feed, programmed to rotate through quotes from senior officers. But when it was Rick's turn, the screen glitched and flashed an error: 404 legacy not found. Someone recorded it, trimmed the footage, and uploaded it to TikTok with mocking background music. In under 2 hours, it was shared tens of thousands of times, a sharp and humorous way of saying the system was now refusing to acknowledge his name as part of collective memory. In the cafeteria, a young cadet walked up to the water dispenser, inadvertently standing beside Rick. But instead of waiting for his turn, he placed his cup back and walked away, leaving the man standing alone in a system that once took his orders, but now turned its back with the smallest of gestures. An older trainer from the Internal Affairs Task Force, when asked about the man who once led him, only shook his head and half-joked, "Some ships don't sink because they're attacked. They sink because the captain drills the hole himself." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Celeste stepped into the meeting room, where only 21 people were present. The empty chairs were scattered. No one spoke, but everyone knew who those seats used to belong to. On a few of them sat half-gas glasses of water, as if their owners hadn't left for errands but because they couldn't continue facing forward. She called no names, didn't read the reasons for absence. She simply stood in the middle of the room, the light from the window catching her shoulder. making the silver badge on her uniform gleam silently. A breeze slipped through the slightly open door, causing the agenda paper to flutter, its sound thin and sharp, slicing through the air like the silence among those who remained. Celeste did not give speeches. She didn't ask who still wants to stay, because to her that was never the right question. Instead, she said one sentence, not too loud, but so precise each syllable felt etched into the wall. Those who are still here choose to stand tall. It was not a command, not encouragement, merely a line drawn. A female officer, once one of Celeste's fiercest critics in the early weeks, nodded slightly. An older white officer straightened his back just a bit more, and a young recruit, his face still baby-soft, gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one spoke. But this silence was no longer rejection. It was listening. And choosing. One of them, Sergeant Daniel Price, the only one who had not submitted a transfer request, stood at the back of the room, near the window, looking out at the yard. He used to drink beer with Rick and used to be part of the internal group called Protecting Tradition. But that afternoon he said nothing, only watched the sky shift in color. When Celeste walked out, Daniel was still there, but for the first time, he didn't avoid her gaze. No polite smile, no evasive stance, just a direct look, as if to say, I haven't decided, but I'm reconsidering. And in that silent moment, a phone rang from inside the room. It was from the phone Rick had left behind on the table, but no one bothered to mention it. The screen lit up with a message. The union declined to issue a joint statement. They said the case does not qualify for image protection. In other words, the system that once protected him was now lifting its hand off his shoulder. No whistle, no official command required. On the 6th floor of police headquarters, the Human Resources office door closed for the 13th time in 2 days. On the desk lay a stack of transfer requests, all from officers who had served under Rick. No prior notice, no need for dialogue. One officer wrote bluntly in the reason section, I don't trust emotionally driven reforms led by media reactions. The form was concise, without unnecessary punctuation or further explanation, but a crease along the margin indicated hesitation before signing. A younger officer, during the final internal meeting, left Rick's badge, removed from his uniform, on Rick's desk, accompanied only by a folder containing notes on unresolved cases, mishandled during Rick's tenure. No one touched it, but the badge remained there all morning, a silent accusation. Celeste received the first copy at 8:02 a.m. She skimmed through it without revealing emotion, nodded to her secretary and requested the remaining list. When the nearly 2-centimeter thick file was placed on her desk, she signed each page without question, callbacks, or delays. Each signature was decisive, like a deployment order. Swift, clean, without a word to persuade anyone to stay. The atmosphere in the office seemed to pause, as if the papers themselves sensed the precise coldness that left no room for resistance. Downstairs, a group of interns whispered about last night's conversation between Rick and the disciplinary board, a closed meeting from which a 2.5-minute audio clip had leaked, capturing Rick losing his temper, pounding the table, and demanding to reassess the accuser's credibility. Just 2.5 minutes, but the clip spread internally like a contagion. The next day in the cafeteria, no one sat with him. His meal tray was moved to the far edge of the last table, where a flickering light and a humming air conditioner seemed to swallow unspoken words. The janitor, after Rick left the room, left his used cup on the table, unwashed, with a folded note underneath reading, People no longer fear you, they just despise you. She didn't look up, didn't ask why, because a true leader doesn't retain those who choose to leave through denial. They look forward, focusing on what needs rebuilding. Rather than being hurt by departures, she acted as if it were a natural filtration process, the old eliminating itself. Meanwhile, in an administrative corner, Lieutenant Eliza Gomez, once sidelined by Rick for lacking experience managing men, sat staring at a reappointment letter. She at once remained silent, stepped back, and considered resigning. But that morning, Celeste signed a temporary appointment, reinstating Eliza to the position she had been unjustly removed from, not due to pressure, but because she deserved it. On the document, Celeste wrote, "We start with those who were left behind." It wasn't a favor, it was her way of rebuilding the system, restoring stolen trust through action. Outside the office, a veteran officer, once reprimanded by Rick for lacking the discipline to lead, quietly stood up, placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder as she stepped into the hallway, said nothing, just nodded slowly, like a passing of trust from one generation to the next. The atmosphere wasn't loud, but the sense of restoration was so palpable that even those who had witnessed Eliza's previous silence now turned to look. That morning, a video began circulating on social media. A young officer, wearing dark sunglasses, removed his badge, threw it to the ground, and set it ablaze in front of headquarters. The video was shaky, but clear. The fire caught, the badge burned, and the officer said, "Only one sentence. This is no longer my team." That statement, just 5 words, spread rapidly. Numerous accounts shared the clip, captioned, "A flame for what has been silent too long." In the comments, many former officers who had quietly resigned began speaking out, recounting internal investigations that were derailed, times they were forced to sign pre-written reports by Rick. One wrote, "I once thought I was alone in that collapse. Today I know I was just the first to fall." Simultaneously, at the reception area, a seemingly harmless exchange became the second spark. A first-year intern asked the receptionist if Lieutenant Rick still held his position. The elderly, usually reserved receptionist replied curtly, "If he still holds the position, he no longer holds face." The statement was recorded by someone behind, and the ensuing laughter amplified it beyond any official announcement. By noon, the phrase had become a meme, accompanied by an image of Rick walking across the parking lot with his head down, his shadow elongated by the sun, captioned, "Consequences don't need a warrant." A brown envelope was delivered to Rick's desk from the Equipment Management Department. Inside was no letter, just an access card with a punched hole and a red stamped note. Access suspended, pending review. No one knocked, no announcement was made. The delivery person merely passed by, as if handing over a destined parcel, requiring no signature. Rick opened it, his finger pausing at the card's edge. Scattered laughter from the common area outside echoed in, as if from another world, a world no longer his. No one cursed him, no one threw stones. They simply withdrew from the space he once dominated, leaving him a void no power could fill. And in that emptiness, he began to understand it wasn't that he lost his seat, but that his credibility had been drained like blood flowing backward. The next morning, the City Council office received a series of urgent emails from the External Affairs Department. The subject lines were identical, as if copied and pasted, regarding the incident involving Police Chief Celeste Monroe. Under the fiery scrutiny of public opinion, previously comfortable seats of power began to heat up. Among them, one individual had proactively stirred the waters, Rick Delaney. Excluded from internal discussions, Rick began seeking help from old allies, those who had supported him during election campaigns, police budget drafts, and under-the-table agreements. He sent private messages to 3 council members, attaching old photos and quoting past promises to protect those who have served. In a series of midnight emails, Rick wrote, "I need your help. We can't let a young upstart control the entire force." That very phrase, young upstart trying to teach others, was leaked by a reporter through an internal system breach. The message was screenshot and spread online within 30 minutes. This time, the reaction extended beyond the police community. A veteran journalist from the Marshall Project tweeted, "If a young upstart can restore ethics to the entire barn, then the barn was already too rotten." The tweet garnered over 400,000 interactions in just 12 hours. A group of law students turned the phrase into a discussion topic, titled "Old Horses and Rotten Barns," hosting a live stream that night with over 50,000 viewers. During the presentation, they juxtaposed Rick's image with excerpts from internal audit reports during his tenure. No analysis needed, just letting viewers draw their own conclusions. Those who once defended him began to fall silent or quietly deleted old posts and removed shared photos, as if instinctively distancing themselves from an emerging collective shame. When Rick appeared at the parking lot behind the council headquarters, once a familiar meeting point for the lobbying group, no one came to greet him. He walked past 3 former subordinates. They stood side by side, pretending to look at their phones. Not a glance, not a greeting. The glass door leading to the administrative wing did not open automatically. His access card had been deactivated. No notice, no explanation. He stood there, his finger pressed against the cold glass, his reflection staring back, weathered, rigid, and no longer part of the game. A photojournalist happened to capture the moment. The image later appeared on the cover of the Gazette Sunday's special issue, beneath the headline, "When the one who opened the door was locked out from within." On public administration forums, a post titled simply "Rick's Last Card" quickly rose to the top of the comment board. The content was just a screenshot of his desperate message, captioned, "Your final card holds no value in a game where the rules have changed." The line was soon printed on T-shirts, stickers, and even quoted in a state senator's speech to police academy students. If someone tells you age always brings wisdom, ask them why that person was unseated by a so-called rookie. The hall burst into laughter, but it wasn't humor. It was vindication, the kind that brews after a long chain of silent injustices finally dragged into the light. Within the force, no one spoke in Rick's defense. An urgent internal ethics seminar was convened at the police academy, and in the section illustrating behaviors to avoid, Rick's image, it was failing to see who actually had the strength to clean up the wreckage he left behind. Celeste silently shared the post. No comment, no hashtag, just letting it spread, like truth finding its way at last. That afternoon, the city council convened a closed-door meeting, officially to review the internal state of law enforcement. But everyone knew this was the first clash between the old guard and the new value system. In the meeting room, 7 members sat around a round table, each with a thick file in front of them. Rick was present as a special guest, a term reserved for those no longer credible enough for official participation, but still allowed a voice. He sat with arms folded, eyes still defiant, as if he were the victim, not the cause. His seat was placed near the door, back to the chairperson's dais, as an unspoken sign that his presence was purely procedural. During a short recess in the closed session, an administrative staffer entered to distribute drinks. Everyone received a glass except Rick. The young woman passed by without a glance, tray empty at his place, as though his presence was a void by default. A conservative member representing the city's downtown district spoke first. "I'm not here to talk feelings. I'm asking, are we throwing away a seasoned officer over a momentary lapse in judgment?" The question was delivered in a smooth voice, polished over many campaign seasons, but the content was crude, like a lid forced over a pressure cooker ready to burst. A few glances turned to Rick, but not with sympathy, more like observing how the defendant reacts. Rick gave a dry chuckle, about to respond, when Layla Whitman shut her file, placed it gently on the table, and locked eyes with the councilman. Then another voice rose, Attorney Layla Whitman, representing the black community, and the only person who had worked with Celeste before her appointment, looked straight at the councilman. She didn't raise her voice, yet the room fell silent. No former employee is exempt from ethics. Seniority does not equal immunity. Then she slid the file forward, revealing 3 old complaints, never processed, all bearing Rick's name. One included a statement from a retired officer who said he'd been pressured to alter records to protect the unit's reputation. In that suffocating atmosphere, a phone suddenly rang, a brief chime from a journalist stationed outside. Though quickly silenced, it jolted the room with a new awareness. This chamber was no longer sealed like they thought. The air was taut like a drawn bowstring. The staffer assigned to record the internal session began to tremble, but he kept filming. That footage, later that night, was leaked by a technician to the local news station, where a newscaster was just waiting for a bombshell to open the primetime broadcast. The 7 o'clock news aired the full 8-minute clip, unedited. Every word, every raised brow, every tap of Rick's pen on the table was transmitted in full to millions. The station ran a simple headline: "While the people demand transparency, the council talks tenure." The screen was split. On the left, Rick strained to justify organizational continuity, while on the right, live viewer comments poured in. Continuity or stagnation? How many complaints did he shove in a drawer? A verified account commented one line: "This table doesn't need more years, it needs someone to sweep up the shards." Within 1 hour, the hashtag not tenure but rose to number 2 nationwide. By 9:30, the anchor had to interrupt their co-host just to report that the station's phone system had crashed under the volume of calls. Not asking questions, just confirming, "Yes, we saw it." On YouTube, the comments didn't discuss policy. They asked one thing: why wasn't Celeste there? The answer came from her directly in a quiet status update: "Because I don't need to hear them protect each other. I'm here to serve the people, not the system." One sentence. No exclamation mark. No hashtag. But within 6 hours, it was shared over 2 million times. A famous actor used that very line as a caption for a black and white photo of Celeste's back as she exited the council building. Low heels, no handbag, light stretching long down an empty hallway. Hundreds of verified accounts of social organizations reposted the sentence like an unbranded slogan. It resonated because it was true and because it came from someone who didn't need to raise her voice. Rick, who once used political leverage to stall decisions, could now only sit and watch as he was dissected. For the first time in his career, he couldn't call anyone, couldn't text anyone. No one answered, because everyone knew siding with him now meant becoming a symbol of a system in collapse. Even the phone Rick once used to coordinate his campaign, once buzzing every morning, now only displayed the auto response. The user is currently unavailable, not because they were busy, but because no one wanted to be labeled the last hand on a sinking ship. A group of media students recreated the 8-minute clip with simple animation, adding mocking subtitles and editing it into a clinical psychological analysis. Rick's voice was distorted, his eyes drawn like flickering flashlights whenever Layla Whitman questioned him. The animation racked up more than 6 million views within 24 hours, becoming the unwanted symbol for those who believed power could be clutched by the dead weight of reputation. That same night, a publishing house specializing in administrative management books abruptly canceled a weekend book signing event featuring Rick. In its place was a statement: "We do not sponsor leadership models that shy away from accountability." An independent journalist received an anonymous message from inside the city ethics committee. "We received a report 3 years ago, blocked by someone who just appeared on the news." The message was screenshotted, posted on Reddit, and spread overnight like a pair of scissors slicing through the last layer of Rick's protective shell. No one believed what he had built anymore, and more importantly, no one feared the consequences of opposing him. Rick, who once used political influence to stall decisions, could now only sit and watch himself being dissected. For the first time in his career, he could not call anyone, could not message anyone. No one picked up, because everyone knew whoever stood by him now would be branding themselves as the last face of a system being discarded. On the Marshall Project or Greg, an investigative report published the next day revealed that Rick had been the one to block internal reform proposals within the police department the year before. The reason noted in the minutes: no need to burden the force due to external pressure. But now the pressure no longer came from outside. It resided within the system itself, from the public, from younger officers, and especially from the quiet yet undeniable presence of Celeste. The headline, "What We Blocked and What We're Paying For Now," became the anchor point for a series of follow-up analyses. Journalists unearthed memos shelved because of Rick's signature. Former officers shared images of reports returned with "not appropriate at this time" stamped in red ink. and one even released audio from a closed-door meeting where Rick scoffed at the idea of establishing an independent internal monitoring system. That laugh, detached and arrogant, was clipped into an 8-second video and posted on TikTok, captioned, "Listen closely. This is the sound of an era dying." The meeting ended in a deadlock. No resolutions were passed, but the real conclusion was clear, not written on paper, but seen in the eyes of those who left their seats. One person quickly pulled up a mask upon spotting Rick near the exit, not to guard against illness, but to avoid being seen in the same frame as him. Another, a legislative aide once close to Rick, when asked for her opinion, merely shook her head. This is no longer a personal story. It's time for each of us to choose where we want to stand in history. A photo of the meeting room door ajar, with Rick's isolated silhouette behind it, circulated widely alongside the caption, "Sometimes, no one needs to push. You back away far enough that no one has to lift a finger." No one shook Rick's hand. No one patted his shoulder. Even the microphone he used to speak was retrieved early by a logistics staffer, placed head down into a drawer, as if to smother the remnants of a voice that once drowned out many debates. He picked up his briefcase and stepped into the hallway, where every gaze was averted as if his presence carried the stench of an unspoken verdict. As he passed the internal bulletin board, he saw his name covered by a freshly printed notice, a call for applications for the position of Independent Ethics Commissioner, the very idea he once flatly rejected. The bolded line, "Candidates encouraged from communities historically disadvantaged by the system," cut coldly across the last vestiges of his pride. He paused for a moment, as if to tear the notice down, but only stood there, his hand clenching, then releasing, because he knew anything he did now would only make him look more pathetic. Only Layla, the only one who stayed to the end, stood at the door, looked at him, and spoke slowly. "You spent your entire career building a world with no room for someone like Celeste, and today you realize it's you who no longer fits." He didn't respond, but the door closing behind him rang like a verdict needing no vote, no counsel. Because for the first time, justice didn't come from deliberation, it came from irreversible exposure. Rick stepped out of the council chamber with footsteps as heavy as the weight of all the years he had abused power. Years no one had dared to name. But what made him bow his head wasn't the criticism, it was the silence. No one waited for him outside. No cameras sought him out. Not even footsteps echoed alongside him, only the buzz of a phone vibrating in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "Watch this." That was the moment Rick realized he no longer controlled the narrative. The hands that once reached out to lift him had now tucked themselves into coat pockets, leaving him alone in a hallway of glass panels that reflected a version of himself even he barely recognized, a fallen man undeserving of pity. The message from a reporter at the Marshall Project contained a single line, "We have the original tapes." No clickbait headline, no sensational language. But when the article was published at 7:15 a.m., that title became the shell that shattered every attempt to look away. The Rick Files, the forgotten tapes. Within 30 minutes, the article's link had reached over 1 million inboxes. No media campaign, no teaser. The rawness of the evidence made it spread like a fracture down the spine of an old marble column. Unstoppable. Unpatchable, leaving only the acknowledgement that collapse was inevitable. The lead image showed Rick looking into a patrol car's dash cam, hand resting on his gun, lip curled into a half-smirk. A moment once meaningless, now the trace of corrupted power. The video collection contained 16 clips, all archived from patrol car cameras, documenting Rick Delaney's interactions with civilians over the past 12 years. 8 of them had never been made public. 5 had been marked as data loss in official reports. 3 had accompanied formal complaints, but were later dismissed due to insufficient evidence of misconduct. But now, they were no longer evidence. They were a verdict. Every frame, every voice, every throat-clearing grunt had become irrefutable proof of how a man turned his position into a weapon of suppression hidden behind the shadow of the law. The first video, released directly on the Marshall platform, dated back to 2016. Rick repeatedly banging the butt of his gun on the hood of a black man's car, shouting, "Get out now, asshole! I don't have time to listen to your crap about civil rights." There was no physical assault, but the violence seeped through his tone, his eyes, his voice twisted into a weapon, and that alone was enough. Beneath the video, tens of thousands of comments flooded in. People naming court cases that were rushed, petitions that had been denied for lack of merit, deaths ruled unrelated to law enforcement. A mother reposted a photo of her son, once pulled from his car by Rick without cause, held for 4 days with no charges, adding the note, "My son didn't have a video, but now I know he didn't make it up." On Twitter, a clip from 2018 resurfaced, Rick standing at the door of an apartment, pounding loudly as the woman inside said she had no warrant. His voice was cold. "My order is enough." Those 6 words were printed on banners, T-shirts, and even protest posters outside the police department headquarters. No one called it evidence anymore. They called it a symptom of a structure finally stripped bare. And when the 10th video aired, Rick tearing up a petition in front of its submitter, then bursting into laughter, the audience did not rage. They stayed silent. But this time, the silence was not for Rick. It was for the years they had been forced to believe silence was the only option. Another clip, from 2013, showed Rick shouting in the face of an Asian woman, "If you don't understand English, go back to your damn country." That woman's brother later became a lawyer, and it was he, now grown and resolute, who submitted the clip to the newsroom with the note, "My family once chose silence, but watching what happened to Celeste, I now know silence is complicity." The clip lasted just 17 seconds, yet it was reshared by dozens of Asian American community accounts as a wound long left unhealed. A Korean Gramat newspaper in California ran the headline in both languages, "From Silence to Justice, when Personal Pain Became Collective Proof." Within 10 hours, more than 100 local newspapers had translated Rick's words. No analysis needed. There was nothing left to defend. Clip 9, blurred by reflected light, captured Rick pinning a teenager's head down onto the hood of a car, hissing, "Just because you're young doesn't mean I can't teach you a lesson." That teenager, now a journalism student, wrote on his personal blog, "I didn't think anyone would believe me. Now, maybe they'll listen." Beneath the post was a grainy screenshot of the video, zoomed in to show Rick's face, teeth clenched, brow furrowed, one hand gripping the collar, the other pressing down on the shoulder of a child not yet 16. Within hours, the blog post was pinned on the homepages of 2 major journalism schools, accompanied by the caption, "Because memory is not meant to be buried alive." Each clip was uploaded with descriptions, timestamps, context, and the status of any internal investigation, if applicable. And what shocked the public wasn't the behavior itself, but its repetition, the invisibility of consequences, the paralysis of the system. One Twitter user created a simple interactive chart. The timeline marked the years Rick violated protocols. The vertical axis labeled names of victims never mentioned in any official report. Tiny squares representing those victims filled half the screen. No one online needed to scream. They simply saw the pattern and understood the repetition wasn't a coincidence, but the result of a culture of complicity that had gone on too long to pretend no one knew. His retired officer named Jacob Mendez posted a self-recorded video against a white living room wall, his face aged but eyes still sharp. "I filed an internal report about Rick 9 years ago, and I was reassigned from command within 2 weeks. No explanation given, but everyone understood. My record was stamped, 'difficult to collaborate.'" His voice wasn't angry, didn't tremble, just steady, as though he had told the truth so many times it no longer hurt. But this time was different. The video was posted on his personal Facebook page. No verification badge, no boosted ads, no hashtags. Yet, in just 12 hours, it had nearly 50,000 shares. Because when the truth is spoken without performance, people believe. That evening, a new hashtag emerged on Twitter, Rick Files. In 8 hours, it had over 200,000 shares. Among them were former colleagues of Rick, saying little, simply posting, "Now you know why we stayed silent." Below the tweet was a photo of Rick, not angry, not tense, but cold, blank, indifferent. That indifference had now become evident. Meanwhile, city officials could no longer deny. The mayor held an emergency press conference, not to defend Rick, but to save himself. Yet during the briefing, a journalist asked, "Sir, how many of these videos were you aware of? And why was none of it ever disclosed?" The question was never answered, and that was the answer. 10 minutes after the conference ended, footage of the exchange circulated across every platform, not as political commentary, but moral outrage. One user wrote, "When a mayor won't say how much he knows, it's because he knows too much to pretend he's innocent." A human rights organization paired the clip with a leaked internal document from 2020, bearing a read stamp next to the mayor's name under a report about Rick's threatening behavior. The red stamp, in review beneath it, had now become a black mark on the entire administration. No one was defending him anymore. No emergency meeting could slow the speed at which social media was now rewriting history in the language of collective fury. At the same time, a senior official in the mayor's office resigned, without press, without a private briefing, leaving only a note taped to their office door, printed in italics. "I don't want to be the last one standing in a room where everyone else turned away from the truth." A photo of the note went viral with a single caption, "Candor is the highest form of ethics during crisis." Not long after, a Latin American activist revealed that Rick had once lobbied to block the creation of a trauma recovery center for victims of police violence, on the grounds that it would set a precedent for validating emotional distortion. That, quote, previously buried in internal meeting minutes, was now printed and posted on the City Hall fence, juxtaposed with Rick's photo and a flood of questions. Which emotions are distorted, fear or truth? Celeste did not speak. She posted nothing, gave no interviews, but people still saw her at a session with new Police Academy cadets. She stepped to the podium, took the mic, and looked directly at the row of 16 young faces awaiting a lesson on law. She said only, "The law won't shield you from the truth. It only gives you a chance to face it." Her words carried no dramatics, no rallying cries, but each syllable struck like a quiet hammer to the minds below, not targeting emotion, but responsibility. One young cadet later posted on the school forum, "I used to think truth came from the top down. Now I know. It comes from those who stay standing when others begin to bow." No one clapped, but the 12-second video clip of her statement was cut and spread with the caption, "Some people don't need to say much, as long as the truth stands behind them." Civil organizations immediately called for a full review of every case Rick had ever handled. Class action lawsuits began to take form. A human rights coalition submitted a request for a federal investigation. It was no longer a personal matter. It had become an earthquake within a system once thought untouchable. The name Rick Delaney was no longer mentioned as a veteran officer, but as a barcode for an era masked by falsified reports and deliberate silence. An interactive map began to circulate online, pinning every location where Rick had handled a case over 2 decades. Red for complaints filed, black for areas with no record left behind. In less than 12 hours, the map covered 2/3 of the city's central region. One Reddit user wrote, "We don't need more explanations. We just need to see what his footsteps left behind." Rick was summoned to report on professional handling procedures in a closed-door meeting, but by now no one believed any meeting could truly be closed anymore. When he arrived at the back gate of City Hall, no one greeted him. No doors were held open. A young security guard stood in the corridor, hand outstretched to scan his badge, as if facing a stranger. Not because he didn't know who Rick was, but because there was no longer any reason to treat him as someone who once held the privilege of walking past every door unchallenged. The meeting took place in a side room. No flags, no water prepared, no nameplate in front of him. A council member later recounted anonymously on a private forum. "We didn't need to ask anything. We just let him listen to his own voice in the recordings, and when he fell silent, we understood. For the first time in his career, he had no script to read from." The leak came just 2 hours later. Rick had left the meeting room, pale-faced, offering no statement to the press, greeting no one. Someone captured the moment he stood, waiting for the elevator, helmet in hand, eyes unfocused, like even he no longer knew which floor offered an exit. In the photo, behind him was a hastily taped poster, "Accountability is an ethical duty, not a personal choice." The image was edited into black and white and spread across platforms as a chilling emblem of a disgraceful retreat. Soon after, another hallway security camera video leaked, this one showing Rick stepping back as a staff member walked past. The staffer did not look at him, did not move aside, simply walked straight, and in that invisibility lay the most profound kind of downfall, not being condemned, but being left behind. The videos from the past had not merely resurfaced like oil slicks. They were a storm that had never passed. They had only waited for the right person to drown. And now, the winds had risen. The last message Rick sent to his legal advisor showed only one checkmark, unread, unanswered. But what truly made him freeze was the white A4 sheet taped directly to the center of his locker door. Not in an envelope, not by email, not through an official summons, just a temporary suspension order, signed by Chief Celeste Monroe, taped with black duct tape onto the very locker where, for 19 years, he had stored his uniform and his belief in his own untouchability. The corner of the paper was slightly creased, as if someone had folded it in hesitation before flattening it down without remorse. The ink was still fresh, the pen stroke slightly indented into the page, suggesting the signer hadn't written to issue a command, but to end an era. No one stood nearby, no one gossiped. There was no crowd, no sympathetic glances, no outrage, only silence, the kind that makes one feel they no longer belong in a space. A coworker walked by, eyes glancing but not lingering, holding a lunchbox and wearing earbuds, as if Rick's presence were background noise not worth addressing. Behind him, someone entering the room noticed the paper, then immediately turned away, not out of fear, but unwillingness to offer any reaction that might be misinterpreted as association. It seemed universally understood this place was no longer his, and no one needed to say it aloud. Rick reached up and peeled the paper off, his hand trembling slightly. Though he tried to appear composed, as if it were all a joke, he opened the locker. It was empty. The uniform was gone, the badge no longer resting in its velvet box. Another piece of paper fluttered out from the top shelf. "Departmental property is under inventory review." No name, no official seal, just a message, as if written to a shadow. The handwriting in black ink slanted slightly to the right, even and cold, not a warning, but as if addressing someone long since removed from the roster. No one needed to confirm that he had been expelled from the system. The stripping of his uniform was symbolic, because everything that tethered him to the force had been falling away for days, in each averted glance, each call left unanswered, each meeting invitation replaced by a leak. Inside the locker door, Rick saw a faded mark where his nameplate once was, a discolored patch of glue, the outline of a square, but the name R. Delaney was now just an empty space. No one had removed it, they had simply let it fall, like a reputation that slips away once nothing can hold it up. A soft click echoed, the sound of the automatic hallway light shutting off after 2 minutes of no motion detected. The entire locker room dimmed under a dull yellow haze, Rick's shadow cast against the locker, stretching and warping, like the shape of power that had once cloaked his wrongdoing, now a distorted remnant with no anchor. A trainee entered, froze upon seeing Rick. The young man's eyes held no fear, no reverence, just a clear, calm gaze, like he was looking at someone who had once been a case study in a lecture about corrupted power. He gave a slight nod, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. "I know who you are, and I know why you're standing there." Rick turned his face away, fumbling through the locker as if searching for some last shred of dignity. But beyond that sheet of paper, the locker offered him nothing, like a body from which the cancer had already been cut without need for warning. 10 minutes later, the internal email system returned an error. Rick tried to send a message to the tech support officer. It bounced back with the notice, "This account is no longer active within the system." He turned to his desktop computer. It was locked. He attempted to log in using his ID code. No response. A system that once felt like an extension of his own body now rejected his existence as if he had never belonged. His account icon vanished from the screen after 3 failed login attempts, followed by a prompt. "Please contact the administrator if you believe this is a mistake." But Rick knew. There was no mistake. Only a decision, carried out like a sentence, with no need for a jury. When he stepped out of the tech office, the workstations were unusually quiet. A female staff member tapped her glass against the desk absent-mindedly, but no one looked up. The sound echoed like a farewell unspoken. Along the hallway, the wall of honor, featuring portraits of veteran officers, remained lit, but Rick's frame had been taken down, leaving behind a precise, hollow square, as if no one had ever stood there. The head of human resources, a salt-and-pepper-made man known for staying neutral amid internal power struggles, appeared at the office door. In his hand was a printed copy of the suspension order. His voice was hoarse, eyes avoiding Rick's. "Rick, I have to read this out. As per protocol." Rick said nothing. The man inhaled deeply. "Under Section 11, Article 4, based on new evidence related to prolonged and unresolved misconduct, Mr. Rick Delaney is hereby suspended from all duties, authorities, and access to the police department system, pending further decision from executive leadership." A pause, then he softly added, "I didn't think this day would come so soon." It wasn't meant as comfort nor pity, but as acknowledgement that even a bystander had seen the line crossed. Rick stood there, offering no resistance, not out of acceptance, but because there was no one left to resist with. His shoulders flinched as another staff member passed without a word, leaving behind only the lingering scent of laundry detergent, the sole remnant of a system that once carried his imprint. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer, the one who had vowed to defend him to the end. The screen displayed connecting for nearly a minute, then switched to voicemail. He tried another number, still silence. He scrolled through his contacts, stopped at a name labeled Press Channel A, hesitated, then skipped it. He knew no one dared pick up the phone for the name Rick Delaney now. The hallway inside headquarters wasn't longer, but his steps felt heavier, as if trudging through sand. Each door closing behind him was another period in a sentence. The sound of magnetic locks snapping into place wasn't loud, but rang irritatingly sharp in his ears, as if the system was quietly punctuating each clause of an indictment that needed no courtroom. Inside his office, his desk was sealed off with red tape under inventory. A tech staffer was dismantling the computer, not looking at him. Fingers tapped the keyboard steadily, erasing the last traces of his existence. An admin worker was sealing files, deliberately avoiding eye contact. She adjusted the seal's position carefully, aligning it with the folder edge, as if ensuring everything was reset, like new, as if Rick Delaney had never sat here. A young woman, an intern, walked by, saw him, hesitated, then took a wide detour as if driven by pure instinct. Her steps weren't rushed, but clearly measured to keep distance. A man who once used authority to make others yield the way is now being avoided like a carrier of moral contagion. The hallway mirrors reflected his isolated figure, walking between rows of locked filing cabinets. Everything was painfully familiar, yet dead silent, like a place devoid of light. He tried to open the cabinet on the right, where he once stored his earliest case files, But the lock had been reprogrammed. He no longer had access, no longer held the right to revisit his own memories. Celeste didn't appear, didn't need to. The suspension came in the same language Rick had used to silence so many others. Official memo, signature, automated systems, sealing tape. No emotion, no negotiation. He who once scoffed at regulations was now devoured by the very system he helped build. No screaming required, just silence. The irony was cruel. He understood each step of the procedure being executed on him. He had personally trained the staff in carrying it out, and now each step was carried out precisely. Not a syllable off, like a symphony composed years ago. Only this time, the name in the score was his. A former colleague walked past in the corridor, coffee cup in hand, glancing at him through the glass. No pause, no greeting, no empathy or disdain, just absolute emptiness. The kind of void that happens when a name is erased from the roster, and everyone agrees it need not be spoken again. The notice board at the end of the hall, which once held Rick's photo for every official speech, now read, "Temporary position reassignment will be announced soon." No name, no reason. That omission was the clearest verdict. His misconduct no longer considered personal, but the inevitable result of power gone unchecked. Rick's nameplate on the office door was removed at 3:12 p.m. A property office staffer arrived to collect the keys, then noted in the log, key number 17, unmarred. A description so cold it chilled the skin, as if the key itself mattered more than the man who held it. On social media, the video clip of Rick leaving headquarters, no escort, no obstruction, was posted 5 minutes after he stepped through the final door. The video's title had no caption, "Walked out on his own," but the comments section read like an indictment, stronger than any case file he'd ever seen. Finally, the system expelled the very man who twisted it. The security camera footage was grainy, but didn't need high resolution to catch Rick's gaze as he passed through the lobby. A stare aimed at no one and nowhere, as if the entire building had turned transparent. A bystander across the street captured video on their phone, catching the moment Rick stepped down the stairs, wind flipping the edge of his coat, forcing him to bow his head to steady himself. A moment later turned into countless memes on Instagram with the caption, "Time for the wind to blow back." Some zoomed into each frame, pointing out the worn-down heels of his shoes, the cracked leather at the toes. A tiny detail, yet symbolically immense. A man who once stepped over others, now unable to maintain even the dignity of his own footing. Not a single person from the department contacted Rick for the next 24 hours. No email, no text, not a single inquiry. He wasn't prosecuted, he wasn't cuffed. But every link had been severed. Clean, swift, and cold, the final message he sent still sat in the sent folder, but would never get a reply. A former colleague who once took a photo with him at a medal ceremony had quietly removed it from the frame, replacing it with a picture of his son's sports team. A small act, yet telling of how erasure begins with what seems harmless. Rick opened the podcast channel that had interviewed him 2 years prior, only to find his episode had been set to private. His voice, his arguments, even the slogan he used to chant, "Discipline saves lives," was now beyond reach, as if even his words had turned against him. Just like how he had once coldly dismantled others. Now it was his turn to become an administrative period. And that period didn't fall from a judge's gavel, nor roar from a verdict, but appeared quietly in the internal system where the status under Rick Delaney's name shifted from active to file closed, no response required. Celeste, without a word, without presence, was still the one who placed that final mark right through the center of his name. Not with fists, not with words, just one line of text. Full suspension, effective immediately. The next morning, City Hall was packed. Not because someone had been arrested, not because a scandal had just erupted, but because a woman sat behind a glass desk, without a nameplate, without a teleprompter, with only a single notebook in front of her, open to the first page. No music, no flags, No ceremonial opening words. The microphone was on, the cameras were rolling, and Celeste Monroe looked up. "I'm not here to retaliate. I'm here to defuse a landmine." That opening line took the air out of the room. No one knew exactly whom she was referring to, but everyone understood. The atmosphere thickened, as if the entire room had crossed an invisible threshold where silence was no longer a choice, and the lights no longer shone to flatter but to expose. Celeste turned a page in her notebook. Black ink, handwritten lines. No bullet points, just notes that looked like they had been scribbled in the middle of the night. The ink slightly smudged at the corners, a few slanted strokes, but every word weighed like an oath. The Reboot the Badge campaign is officially launched, not to polish the badge for aesthetics, but to ask whether that badge deserves to exist at all. She did not read fast, nor loudly. She read as if speaking directly to the system watching her through the lens, and to those behind the curtain who had believed their names would never be called. She used no slides, no projector screen. The list of 17 positions within the police department under reevaluation was read aloud, one name at a time. No repetition, no omission. Each name rang out like a scalpel, removing a corrupted cell. At the 10th name, a reporter turned to his colleague and whispered, "He was just honored last month, wasn't he?" No one replied, because no award could mask the traces left by forgotten files. By the 12th name, someone standing behind the glass wall outside the hall pulled out their phone, read the incoming message, and their face turned pale. Among the names was one man who had once been Celeste's direct supervisor during her internship. He once said, "This girl won't last a season." Now, no one repeated that line, because one season had become the blade trimming down an entire era he thought untouchable. Her voice didn't need a microphone to carry. Anyone who made mistakes and is still here will have the chance to make amends. If not, leave. She paused, then spoke more slowly. "I'm not rebuilding the system to hand out mercy. I'm restructuring it to stop it from manufacturing violence." A reporter raised his hand. "Do you expect backlash?" Celeste looked him straight in the eye. "Go ahead, just 2 words." But the entire press room lost temperature. Not because of what she said, but how she looked when she said it. No fire, no fury, just the calm resolve of someone who had been pelted with stones but never stepped off her chosen path. Another journalist from a conservative political outlet tried to bait her into personal conflict. "Do you believe these decisions are personal?" Celeste didn't even hesitate. "I don't care about the personal feelings of those who covered up misconduct. I care about the transparency of the structure they represent." At the back of the hall, an elderly woman stood up, lifting a battered, crumpled file folder. 14 years ago, my son died while in custody. Not a single line of investigation. Thank you for daring to reopen it." She did not cry, but her hand trembled. The cameras zoomed in. No one cut the scene. As Celeste reached the final page of her notebook, a phone rang. No one picked it up. The entire room seemed frozen in its own anxious breath. Within 30 days, all operational files tied to overlooked cases from the past 10 years will be reopened. Some people may not like it, but the truth doesn't need to be liked. A man in a gray suit, former communications aide to Rick Daley, walked out midway through, but the door didn't close. It stayed ajar, like a sign that this wasn't over. The TV station cut the live feed with the red banner scrolling across, "Celeste Monroe declares war on the old system." But everyone present knew she wasn't declaring war. She was declaring death. An audio technician, seated by the mixer, stopped watching the monitor. He stared at the face of a male reporter who was trying to take notes, but whose hand was visibly shaking. Behind them, someone murmured, "No one can save those who once forced us into silence." A person stood up, turned toward the camera, and held up a handwritten note. "Rick covered up 6 cases. We have proof." No one applauded at the end, but no one left early, because the prevailing emotion wasn't elation, it was shock, as if someone had just placed a live grenade on the table and said, "I'm not afraid of it exploding. I just won't let it keep lying here." Celeste closed her notebook and stood up. The cameras kept rolling. A journalist whispered, "She's walking through a battlefield without wearing armor." And another, who had once interviewed her during the allegations against Rick, murmured with near reverence, "And she's not trembling." The conference room doors opened. Celeste didn't wait for security. She didn't get into a private car. She walked out alongside the group of new cadets, making no distinction between who was who, because she had once been the one sitting in the back row of the class, and now it was those very back row seats that would bear witness to a reconsensus. In the corridor leading down to the parking lot, a man in a lieutenant colonel's uniform walked in the opposite direction. He stepped aside when he saw Celeste approaching, but his eyes betrayed tension. Not out of respect, but because he knew his name might already be in the red file she had just signed. A young cadet walking behind muttered, "That man once screamed in my face when I reported misconduct. Now he has to lower his head and stare at the ground." The Reboot the Badge campaign did not hang banners at the gate. It had no official logo, but every transfer order, every name on the reassessment list, every stunned face at the press conference, all made one thing clear. The badge was no longer a symbol, it was a promise, and those who failed to keep that promise would be removed from the ranks. No gunfire needed, no fanfare. Rick Daly received his departure notice only 10 minutes after the meeting ended. No escort. No one looked him in the eye. A receptionist placed a new security pass on the counter, looked him straight in the face and said, "You don't need to return it. It'll deactivate within an hour." It wasn't a notification, it was a verdict. In the parking lot, a group of young officers was laughing intermittently. They went silent the moment Rick passed by. No one greeted him. One turned away and spat on the ground. Rick quickened his pace but still clearly heard the sentence fall like a stone striking steel. The man who once ordered others to stay silent. Now no one wants to hear him speak. On social media, the photo of Rick bowing his head as he left headquarters spread like a warning. The empire of fear doesn't collapse by force, but by being forgotten. The official account of the campaign reposted the image with just 3 words, "No badge needed," because this time the person who pressed the button was a woman who had once been pushed to the edge of the law and chose to rebuild the fence with her own hands. After the press conference, Celeste's office received a brief email. No subject line, no signature. "I hope to meet privately to clarify some misunderstandings." The sender, Rick Delaney. No apology, no formal tone. Yet, only 1 hour later, he appeared at headquarters, for the first time since his suspension, wearing a dark suit, a neat tie, and holding 2 cups of coffee. As he passed the reception desk, an on-duty staff member who was taking notes looked up, saw him, and silently flipped her nameplate face down on the counter. No one offered him water, no one asked his purpose. A young officer even turned his face away, leaving the walkway clear, as if avoiding a pocket of toxic air. Celeste's door was unlocked, but he still knocked lightly, waited a moment, then entered. She looked up, not surprise, no smile, just a vacant gaze, as if she had known exactly when he would show up. Rick placed the coffee on the desk, gently slid it toward her like a gesture of reconciliation. "I brought what you used to like, if I remember correctly," he said, his voice tinged with both regret and hesitation. Celeste did not touch the cup. She did not reply either. For a fleeting moment, the light reflected on the cold plastic lid evoked those closed-door meetings where Rick used to make staff remove their masks so I can see the face of loyalty. No one mentioned that memory, but the silence in the room made it manifest. Rick sat down, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered as if the wind had drained all spirit from him. Outside the glass window, a group of trainees was practicing formation drills. One of them turned his head, recognized Rick through the glass, and whispered something that made the whole group burst out laughing. The sound didn't enter the room, but the expressions were unmistakable. Rick caught a glimpse, then quickly looked away, but it was too late. The shame had already seeped in, like a collar tightening around his suit. Inside, the air thickened. A small drop of coffee fell from the lid of the untouched cup, spreading into a perfect circle, like a blot of ink on an unresolved misconduct file. "I didn't know who you were when that happened," Rick said, not looking her in the eyes. Celeste showed no reaction. She let the silence stretch just long enough for every word of his sentence to echo, then asked, her voice low but clear as a blade, "And if I were still nobody, what would you have done?" Rick swallowed hard. He tried to force out a wrinkled smile, but no one would buy that kind of smile now. I just thought maybe we could handle this internally without blowing it up." His words trailed off in the slow whir of the ceiling fan. Celeste stood up. Rick flinched and stood as well. He didn't dare move closer, just slightly raised a hand as if to grasp something that had slipped away, but that hand floated mid-air, with nowhere to land. Outside the door, an admin staff walked past the frosted glass and paused briefly, not out of curiosity, but as if to confirm to herself, yes, he does know how to bow his head now. The meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. No promises, no follow-ups. Celeste turned and walked out, never touching the coffee, never looking back. Rick remained still. The coffee cup on the desk began to cool. The steam vanished, and with it, the final opportunity he had once thought he could control with a deep voice and a tidy suit. Outside the office, the hallway, once quiet, now felt almost uncomfortable, with the sound of Celeste's footsteps striking a steady rhythm, like a verdict being executed. An IT staff member from the adjacent room opened the door just as Rick was stepping out. The girl's glance passed over him, as if scanning a line of outdated data with no remaining system value. Celeste exited the hallway, the yellow light casting over her coat like a cold armor. A hallway attendant tilted his head slightly. "Did you meet with him, ma'am?" She simply replied, "I didn't meet anyone. I just listened to confirm that they still haven't changed." Behind her, Rick still stood beneath the dim fluorescent light, casting his lonely shadow across the cold, tiled floor. A janitor, pushing a supply cart, passed by, silently placed a small sign on the lounge table. "This area will be cleaned every 10 minutes. Aimed at no one in particular, but at that moment, in that location. It made Rick take a step back to avoid it, as if even the space itself was rejecting his presence. Inside the room, Rick sat for a while. He looked down at his hands. They were not trembling, but they no longer held any strength either, and for someone who had lived by giving orders, the inability to touch anything made him realize true power does not lie in the ability to shout. It lies in the eyes of the one who can silence others without uttering a word. Those 4 minutes for him were the longest sentence ever passed without a judge reading the verdict. And when he left, no one saw him out, no one asked a thing, as if his very existence was already being erased, line by line, from the history of the very system he once believed belonged to him. As Rick left headquarters like a fading shadow, with nowhere left to cling to, outside another wave had begun to form, quiet but unstoppable. It was not Celeste who called for it. It was not initiated by the police department. It was the community, the very people who had once remained silent, once doubted, now speaking out together for the first time, for someone wearing a police uniform. They had not forgotten those past press conferences, where Rick sat at the center table, tapping his ring on the glass and saying, "The public should stay in order if they don't understand the situation." Now the public needed no further understanding. They only needed to remember and respond. A chain of bakeries in the downtown area, once proudly displaying Rick's photo from a fundraising campaign for children, quietly took it down and replaced it with a quote from Celeste. "We don't need someone beloved. We need someone who honors the oath." 3 days after the press conference, a petition titled simply "Keep Chief Monroe" surpassed 1 million signatures. No advertising, no hashtag campaign, no plea for support, just individuals, from students to veterans, from nurses to drivers, leaving their names beneath a single declaration, "We don't want to go back to the old days." A media student commented on the petition site, "I once interviewed Rick. He said something that haunted me ever since. Discipline doesn't need transparency, just results. Now I understand why the system rotted." That comment was quoted on national television as part of the evening's highlights, alongside footage of Rick walking out of headquarters with slumped shoulders, and no one by his side. A single mother from the south side of the city posted a self-recorded video in her kitchen. Yellow light, a hoarse voice from fatigue. Last night, my son, 6 years old, asked me for the first time in his life, "Mom, can police be good people?" I don't need to say anything else. The clip had no editing, no effects, but it spread like wildfire, because truth does not need embellishment. A seasoned journalist shared the video with a cold caption. Rick once said the media cannot change the nature of a force. Maybe he was right, the media doesn't change the nature, it just removes the mask. The momentum wasn't built on justifications, it came from a collective awakening, and this time, no one wanted to go back to sleep. At a law school, a group of final-year students held a special seminar, Legal Reconstruction from the Ground Up. Afterward, they sent Celeste a package. No thank you note, no invitation, just a city map dotted with countless red marks. These are the locations of racial conflict in the past 10 years. If you need a place to start, here it is. Celeste gave no response, but the map was laminated and pinned to her strategy board like a scar never to be forgotten. No speeches, no posts, no press conferences, yet Celeste still appeared on Saturday night at a small ceremony in Lincoln Park, where the black community gathered to honor victims who had never been brought into the light. She did not wear her uniform, carried no badge. She simply stood at the end of the line, hands clasped behind her back, head slightly bowed. But when an elderly woman recognized her, clouded eyes lighting up, the entire crowd erupted into applause. Not thunderous clapping, but wave after wave, like surf, like a community realizing that the one who now stood for their long-silenced voices had finally risen and stood in the right place. In a near-sacred moment, a man pulled an old, corner-cracked police ID card from his coat pocket, raised it, and tossed it into a public trash bin directly in front of Celeste. He said nothing, but that act left many in the crowd stunned, because they knew the man behind the falsified reports all those years had been this man's former superior, Rick Delaney. A regional television station issued a short bulletin, "Spontaneous public support for the police chief, rare in modern history." But the rest stayed silent, because for the first time, there was a police chief who didn't need the media's protection to survive. She was protected when a photojournalist tried to snap a candid shot of Celeste from behind, hoping to capture an angle evoking emotion for an article titled, "A Hero Who Doesn't Need the Spotlight." He inadvertently caught a teenager tugging his father's sleeve, whispering, "I think that's Rick, the guy who yelled at Auntie Asha at the checkpoint." The father replied, without turning his head, "If there's anyone whose name doesn't belong here, it's his." At a community hospital, the commemorative plaque in the hallway, once bearing Rick Delaney's name as a benefactor, was quietly removed. The person who took it down left no note, but the next morning, someone posted a handwritten message in its place. Honor cannot be bought with money. It is preserved only by a memory that refuses to shut its eyes. That message went viral on social media, alongside the caption, "The man who once signed off on blocking autopsies is now being denied recognition by nurses themselves." The story triggered a domino effect. 3 educational institutions canceled security consulting contracts Rick had once signed. An essay competition within the school system was canceled on the same day the winners were to be announced, after it was discovered that the judging panel included someone Rick had personally appointed. At a building near the central square, a banner was quietly hung from the 6th-floor balcony. "If the law is a knife, then at least let it be held by someone who doesn't wish to stab." No signature, but everyone knew it was meant for Celeste. 1 week later, a group of high school students sent a handwritten letter. "You don't know us, but we know you. Because of you, we know that waiting for justice is real, as long as we don't give up." She kept that letter in her desk drawer, right beneath the map of red dots. At another school, 2 blocks away, a civics teacher removed all teaching materials that had once quoted Rick Delaney Instead, he placed a whiteboard at the center of the classroom with a single line written in cursive. Justice does not begin with power. It begins with conscience. A student snapped a photo and posted it with the caption, "Teacher said, starting this week, we only learn from those who don't hide behind their title." Celeste did not shed a tear. She did not smile either. But during the next day's internal briefing, when a young officer asked, "Chief, do we need more people to join the review campaign?" she simply replied, "We don't need more. Only the right ones." It was not a line meant to comfort. It was a warning. At the far end of the table, a senior inspector nodded subtly, while the legal aide who had once worked closely with Rick quietly put away his phone. On the screen, a notification had just appeared. "Your request for reassignment has been denied. Reason: not eligible for reinstatement to any current leadership position." He didn't react, but everyone at the table saw his hands tighten under the edge, trembling slightly. Trust is not a reward. It is a form of confidence, built from the rubble of those once trampled. And now, as those very people stood to protect her, it was the moment the system had to step back, or risk being swept away. Rick, once invited to lecture at the National Police Academy as a model of organizational stability, was now just a name quietly removed from the training curriculum without announcement. When he entered the Legal Archives library, where he once had a private office to search case files, his access credentials had expired. A young employee, just 3 months into the job, looked at him from behind the service desk and said, with no courtesy, "You'll need to book an appointment through the Public Relations office. And don't forget your ID card." Celeste still gave no speech, but her presence in the park, online in every signature line, was recreating what the justice system had long lost: recognition without decree. A young female attorney, once cut off mid-sentence by Rick in court, posted a status, "The day he lost power, I wasn't happy, I was relieved." That seemingly personal remark was shared by tens of thousands, each adding a line about the moment they were drowned by the system and why they chose to stand with Celeste, not because she was strong, but because she never backed down. And when a 6-year-old girl saw her on TV, turned to her mother and asked, "Mom, is she the one guarding the door?" The mother smiled. "No, sweetie, she's the one who changed the lock." Monday morning's internal court session was unlike any held before. No camera whirs, no media crowding the hallway, just a room with wooden walls, dim yellow light, and air thick enough to feel like a storm was waiting to break. And there, where Celeste had once been insulted, once shoved, now she sat in the commanding seat, the chair for the overseer of conduct, the one who would record every testimony, every expression, every glance. At the far end of the gallery, a young judicial officer clutched a bundle of documents, eyes occasionally drifting toward Rick, as though looking at a relic of history no one wanted to admit they had once belonged to. Rick's seat sat slightly off to the right, no companion, no personal attorney, just a faded nameplate placed in front of him like a final courtesy before being withdrawn. Rick entered without a uniform, without a badge, just a man in a wrinkled gray suit, eyes darting nervously, lacking the arrogance that once made the entire department walk on eggshells. He glanced around the room as if searching for an exit, but the doors were closed, and above each doorway, the symbol of justice scales remained level. On the hearing table lay an internal report nearly 200 pages thick, opened to the first page, which bore a bold printed line, "Request for full re-examination of all conclusions," signed by Rick Delaney, between the years 2012 and 2021. A hearing technician stepped forward to reconnect the microphone in front of Rick, but when he tried to say thank you, the technician turned away without a word, as if they hadn't heard or didn't need to respond. The hearing began. The first witness to take the stand was a retired officer, none other than the man Rick had once threatened in a closed-door meeting 10 years ago. He walked with a cane, left leg still limping, the result of an accident, long rumored to have been training negligence, but today he spoke. Before saying a word, he stopped in front of Rick, said nothing, and pulled from his coat pocket a photocopy of an old disciplinary report that had once been forcibly destroyed. He placed it on the table, then stepped up to the stand. That silence weighed more than any indictment. I once reported Rick Delaney's misconduct. I filed complaints, met with internal affairs, and I was reassigned to night duty for sewing division within the ranks. Today, I don't come seeking justice for myself. I'm here to prove this system knew, but it chose silence. The words hit like gravel dropped onto hardwood, followed by a stretch of silence so deep it felt as if someone had drained all the oxygen from the room. One hearing board member folded his hands, lightly bit his fingertip, but no one stepped in to ease the moment. A woman in the audience, a former records officer from back then, nodded slowly, tears quietly rolling down her cheeks while her lips pressed tightly shut, as if she had finally heard a truth long buried. There was no applause, but the air had thickened. Rick lowered his head, or perhaps he simply no longer dared to lift it. Then came the video clip. No fast forward, no blurring of faces, a clear scene of Rick kicking hard at the leg of a handcuffed suspect, not for resistance, but for giving a dirty look. The curse that followed echoed sharply, causing two observers in the room to turn their faces away. And Celeste, she did not blink. A member of the oversight board, a former colleague of Rick's, quietly set his pen down on the table when the video reached the moment Rick shouted, "I am the law here." That small act unremarkable on the surface, was like a trigger switch for the whole room to realize. No one remained seated there to defend him anymore. In the gallery, a young female officer clenched her fist tightly, not from rage, but because 6 years ago she had been forced to resign after sending an internal email reporting Rick's violent behavior. Today, she sat there in civilian clothes, watching him relive the very past he had once forced others to bury. When asked to respond to a series of investigative questions, Rick answered the first one evasively. By question number 6, a query about his motive for threatening an internal witness, he fell silent. The clerk repeated the question. He still did not respond. A 10-second silence followed, and then the lead examiner nodded and wrote down, "The defendant declined to answer question number 6. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was louder than the breath in the room. Rick swallowed dryly, glancing around instinctively, his eyes drifting across faces as if searching for a sympathetic look, but none came. A man in the second row, a former investigative attorney who had once been forced by Rick to withdraw from a police brutality prosecution, quietly removed his glasses and slowly cleaned them, as if erasing a stain that had once marred his own record. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Those Rick once silenced were now watching the remnants of his fire flicker with no way out. Celeste did not need many words. She simply looked down at the file, crossed out one line, then looked up at Rick, just once, with eyes no longer angry, no longer indignant, but so cold they were numb. "Now, I'm the one who takes the minutes." One sentence, heavy as a hammer striking the concrete foundation that had held up so many lies. Rick flinched, but did not speak. He knew resistance now would be like throwing a stone into frozen water. Outside the hallway, through the frosted glass, the shadows of a group of first-year trainees passed by. They walked past the hearing room without glancing inside, not because they didn't know the hearing was taking place, but because they had been trained to understand. Some mistakes are not worth remembering by name. At the end of the session, no one escorted him out. No one offered a handshake. Not a single paper was handed over to reassure him. He walked out, empty-handed, no seat reserved, no row of supporters. No one looked up. The room resembled a morgue, except the body inside was still breathing, only no longer allowed to speak. And Celeste, she left the room later than anyone else. She paused right at the spot where Rick once brushed past her shoulder, once sneered at her, once forced her to stand next to the restroom. The gray wall beside the entrance still bore faint marks where a crooked sign had once hung. "This area is not for subordinates to speak unless spoken to," a cold slogan, but those it had once oppressed never forgot the feeling of being silenced by an invisible hand of power. Today, that sign was gone. Only 4 old nail holes and a faint scratch remained, a relic of something that had once existed through cowardice. At that exact spot, a young janitor was wiping down the door handle. When he saw Celeste, he paused, slightly bowed his head. No one spoke, but his eyes said enough. This time they were not cleaning because they were told to. They were cleaning so the past would have nothing left to cling to. She touched the edge of the old wooden bench, did not wipe it, did not brush it off, then walked away without looking back. The dim hallway lights stretched along her path as her footsteps echoed rhythmically between the thick glass walls where Rick had once strutted with dominance. Now, no one stood on either side to observe. No one took photos. But across the glass, in the waiting area on the other side, a group of 3 people were whispering. One of them stopped mid-sentence when he saw Celeste, folding the newspaper in his hand, a front-page image of Rick covering his face. The bold headline, "From Pillar to Phantom. A fall without mourning." They did not greet Celeste, but they didn't avoid her either. They looked at her as if witnessing the conclusion, not of a man but of a regime that had survived on the fear of others. Not far from where she passed, the door to the Internal Affairs office remained ajar. Inside, the task assignment board had been updated. Rick's name struck through, marked internally frozen. The officer on duty next to the board, instead of working, was browsing the internal network, a platform where the anonymous letters Rick had once ignored were now published as official training material. One of those letters, handwritten, ending with the line, "If I disappear, know that I tried to warn you," was now framed on the wall of the archive room. Celeste walked past it without stopping, but the image hit her memory like a hammer. Back when she had placed that very letter on Rick's desk, only to be met with a smirk and the line, "Don't let your feelings derail organizational order." This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about confirmation. Justice is not a chair, it is the person allowed to sit in it at the right moment, at the very end. There was no sentence read aloud, no handcuffs, no gavel striking the wooden bench, but everyone knew Rick had been condemned, not by a court, but by the very system he once hid behind, not by someone shouting in his face, but by everyone turning away. The dismissal order came printed on a thin piece of paper with no official seal, just one single line at the bottom, effective immediately. He arrived at the office at 6:49 the next morning, earlier than usual. But the main door didn't open. He had to press the buzzer 4 times. A young security guard appeared, said nothing, simply handed him a spare key from his chest pocket, an obsolete key with no value, then turned away. No greeting, no eye contact. That gesture carried no hostility, only the quiet dismissal of someone who no longer considered the man before him part of anything real. Rick stood there for a moment, holding the cold key, before pushing open the side door, reserved for logistics staff, to slip inside. Inside the lobby, the dim glow of fluorescent lights spilled across the floor he once strode over daily with the weight of authority, now pale and excessive. The fingerprint scanner had been removed. Against the base of the wall lay a flipped-over sign, on the back written in red ink, "Security protocols updated, effective as of yesterday, 1 day." But for Rick, that gap felt like falling out of the era he once dictated. As he stepped into the main hallway, the yellow light illuminated the wall, where a photo of him receiving a commendation had once hung, now bare. The nameplate on his office door had been removed. The glue residue remained, smeared and vague, like a name peeled away from collective memory. A passing intern paused briefly upon seeing him, then quickly turned away. She slowed her pace, as if to make sure he heard the recording playing from her phone, a radio news segment repeating its final line. "Mr. Rick Delaney has been removed from the internal reference list. Decision effective immediately." The volume wasn't high, but every word carved through the space like a public language revocation of power. In the office, the leather chair had been turned backward. The drawers were empty. The laptop is locked. Internal email permanently disabled. Rick tried powering on the device, entered his password, and a red message appeared. User does not exist. A reply colder than any disciplinary ruling. On the desk lay only one old file, paper-clipped haphazardly as if someone had deliberately left it that way. The first page was a copy of a resignation letter from an officer who had accused Rick in 2016, reassigned shortly after submitting it. The final page was pinned with a handwritten note. Sometimes memories don't live in our minds, but in what we were forced to forget. No signature, no farewell. He walked the hallway where he once intimidated new recruits, once whistled at female staff using cheap nicknames. The same faces remained, but now no one stepped aside, no one greeted him, and no one cared. A group of employees was having coffee in the corridor to the right. When they saw him approach, they continued chatting, but shifted topics to false authority syndrome and leaders without integrity, phrases spoken clearly enough to erase any claim of coincidence. Rick paused, then walked on, saying nothing. Each step was heavy, as though dragging the weight of a shadow that no longer had a place to fall. To become invisible is the highest penalty for someone who once forced others to bow just to be seen. A young officer stood inside the elevator. When the door opened and saw Rick, he didn't press the hold button. He simply looked through the glass, an expression not of anger or contempt, but as if he were watching a bad memory about to fall out of the organization's notebook. Rick quickened his pace, but the doors had closed. The metallic sound wasn't loud, but it echoed just enough in the empty corridor to resemble the final click of a courtroom that had outlived its appeal window. On the next floor, the Human Resources door stood ajar. Inside, a female employee was signing the internal clearance register. Rick paused, as if about to knock, but her gaze swept past him, not as if looking at someone familiar, but as if verifying whether the figure at the threshold still belonged to the system or was merely the after-image of a misaligned era. As he packed his things, a few old files, a tarnished medal, and a photo with a former chief of police, no one came to say goodbye. No one reached out to shake his hand. The photo slipped from the edge of the box as Rick passed the records room, landing softly on the stone floor. A trailing intern saw it, picked it up, then didn't return it. Simply placed the photo on the reception desk, right next to a new form marked boldly at the top. Anonymous report on abusive power behavior. No one said anything, but the air in the room made it clear Rick was no longer someone people talked about. He was someone they had spoken of enough that he didn't need to be mentioned again. He carried the box across the main lobby. Once, people would rise whenever he entered. Now, no one lifted their head. An officer pouring coffee nearby leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "That seat's vacant now," just loud enough for Rick to hear, just soft enough to avoid formal accountability. At the end of the lobby, the announcement board had just been updated. On the list of pending reassignments, Rick's name had been blacked out with a permanent marker, a thick, haphazard stroke, but deliberate, as if the person writing feared that if they didn't press hard enough, the past might resurface through the blur. Outside, a light rain fell, not enough to soak his clothes, but enough to make Rick's palms feel clammy with cold. He walked slowly past the statue of service, honor, responsibility, standing at the center of headquarters, a place once used for promotional photos, now strewn with fallen leaves beneath its base. There was no public verdict read aloud, no handcuffs, no gavel striking the wooden bench. Yet everyone knew Rick had been condemned, not by a court, but by the very system he once hid behind, not by someone shouting in his face, but by everyone turning away. The dismissal order was signed on a thin sheet of paper, without a red seal, just a single line at the bottom, effective immediately. He arrived at the office at 6:49 the next morning, earlier than usual, but the main door was locked. He had to ring the bell 4 times. A young security guard appeared, said nothing, simply handed over a spare key from his chest pocket, now obsolete, then turned away. No greeting, no eye contact. The gesture carried no hostility, merely the quiet demeanor of someone who no longer considered the man before him part of any real structure. Rick stood for a moment, still holding the cold key, before pushing through the side entrance, meant for logistics staff, to slip inside. Inside the lobby, the dim fluorescent light cast a pale glow on the floor where he once strode daily with authority, now appearing faded and superfluous. The fingerprint scanner had been removed. At the base of the wall lay an overturned sign, its backside marked in red ink, "Security Protocol Update effective as of yesterday, 1 day." But for Rick, that gap felt like falling out of the era he once imposed. As Rick stepped into the main hallway, the yellow light illuminated the wall where his photo, receiving a medal, once hung. Now bare. The nameplate outside his office had been removed. The old adhesive still clung, smudged, blurred, like a name peeled from collective memory. An intern passing by paused briefly upon seeing him, then quickly turned away. She walked more slowly, seemingly to let him clearly hear the audio playing from her phone. A radio news clip repeating the final line. "Mr. Rick Delaney has been removed from the internal reference list. Decision effective immediately." The volume wasn't loud, but each word sliced through the air like a public revocation of authority. Inside his office, the leather chair was turned backward. The drawers were empty. The laptop was access-locked. Internal email permanently disabled. Rick tried to power on the computer, entered his password, and a red message appeared. "User does not exist." A response colder than any disciplinary ruling. On the desk lay only an old file folder, clipped askew as if someone had deliberately left it. Its first page, a copy of the resignation letter from an officer who had reported Rick in 2016, transferred immediately after submitting it. The last page held a handwritten note. Sometimes memories don't reside in recollection, but in what one is forced to forget. No signature, no salutation. He walked down the hallway where he once intimidated newcomers, once whistled at female staff with cheap nicknames. Now the same faces remained, but no one flinched. No one greeted, and no one cared. A group of employees sat drinking coffee in the hallway to the right. Seeing him approach, they continued their conversation, but the topic shifted to the syndrome of false authority and leaders lacking character. Phrases spoken clearly enough to be unmistakable. Rick paused, then moved on, saying nothing. Each step felt heavy, as if carrying his own shadow, now with nowhere to fall. Invisibility is the highest punishment for one who once forced others to bow just to exist. A young officer stood in the elevator. The door opened, saw Rick, and didn't press the hold button. Just looked through the glass, eyes neither angry nor contemptuous, but as if observing a bad memory about to be erased from the organization's ledger. Rick quickened his pace, but the door had closed. The metallic sound wasn't loud, but it echoed through the empty hallway like the latch of a trial long past its appeal deadline. On the next floor, the Human Resources office door was ajar, a female employee signing off on internal handover documents. Rick paused, seemingly about to knock, but her gaze passed over, not as if seeing a familiar person, but as if verifying whether the figure at the door still belonged to the system or was merely a remnant of a misguided era. As he packed his belongings, a few old files, a tarnished medal, and a photo with the former police chief, no one came to bid farewell. No one offered a handshake. The photo slipped from the box's edge as Rick passed the records room, landing softly on the stone floor. An intern walking behind saw it, stopped to pick it up, but didn't return it, merely placed the photo on the reception desk, right next to a new form titled in bold, "Anonymous Report on Misuse of Authority." No words were exchanged, but the room's atmosphere was enough for Rick to understand he was no longer a subject of gossip, but someone about whom enough had been said that no further mention was necessary. He carried the cardboard box, walked through the main lobby, where people once stood upon his entrance. Now no one looked up. An officer, pouring coffee nearby, softly said to a colleague, "That chair's now vacant." The voice was just loud enough to reach Rick's ears, yet subtle enough to avoid official accountability. At the end of the lobby, a notice board had just been updated. In the list of positions awaiting reappointment, Rick's name had been blacked out with indelible ink. A thick, haphazard stroke, but firm, as if the writer feared that if not written strongly enough, the past might resurface from the blur. Outside, a light rain fell, not enough to soak his clothes, but enough to make Rick feel a chill even in his palms. He walked slowly, passing the statue titled Service, Honor, Responsibility, placed at the headquarters center. Once a spot for commemorative photos upon promotion, now only a few fallen leaves lie at the statue's base. The sheet appeared in the newsroom's mailbox with no handwritten signature, no return address, printed only in Times New Roman, 12-point font. The default size of despair. From the very first line, it made the editor sit upright. I don't know what I fear more, your skin color, or the fact that you stayed silent and still won. Rick wrote a public apology letter, devoid of any sign of sincerity, merely the final erosion of a man with nothing left to hold on to. He avoided the word regret, refused to use forgiveness, only listed actions, attempting to scrub them away with the dry, outdated language of an emotionless, soulless office memo. Each sentence felt like a worn scratch on an old business card that no one kept anymore. The letter spanned 2 pages, published on the pale gray background of a local news site, formatted meticulously like an administrative petition, its opening paragraph so hollow that readers couldn't tell if he was confessing or trying to reclaim some shred of worth. Even the signature simply read, Former Law Enforcement Officer, without a rank, as if he, too, knew the title now only deepened the wound. The article was published. No one shared it, no hashtags. The first comment stood out in isolation. Too late. No one liked it, but more than 200 people reacted with the laugh emoji. On an internal investigator forum, someone screenshotted the part where Rick tried to quote procedural policy and added a caption, digging his own grave with the laws he used to threaten others. The phrase quickly became a meme, printed on coffee mugs sold in a shop near the headquarters, where Rick's photo once hung on the wall of honor, now replaced with a taped-up note, empty space, because history needs time to scrub itself clean. But Celeste still saw it through a link sent by an assistant. She skimmed the article, paused at the final sentence. If I could go back, I wouldn't stay silent when someone like you walked into the room. A sentence that feigned concession, yet carried the bitterness of someone incapable of owning fault, only lamenting that he hadn't been more subtle in preserving his position. She closed the screen, shut the laptop, said nothing. From the conference room's glass door, a few passers-by caught her gaze in that moment, not angry, not smiling, just as if they'd seen a dead document in a living age, something no longer capable of stirring even pity. No response from her. No statement, not a word. That silence once again became a verdict. And this time not just for Rick, but for everyone who ever believed that power resided in having the right to speak, to shout. A black columnist wrote in the morning editorial, her silence is the most expensive answer the administrative history of this city has ever received. Rick submitted job applications. A suburban mall needed a night security guard. No higher education required. Just security experience. He filled out the forms, printed his background check, and revised every period. But after 7 days, the email response came. We appreciate your application, but the position has been filled by a more suitable candidate. The short, polite message felt like a handshake of refusal, offering no room for reply, and certainly no wish for luck. Rick read it over and over, searching for any loophole that might convince him this was all a coincidence. But it wasn't, because after that he applied to 3 more places: a supermarket, a multi-level parking garage, a private elementary school is seeking a gate supervisor. None responded. No rejection letters, no explanation calls, just voids in the inbox, as if his name had landed on a list, unspoken yet universally understood. Do not hire. Only then did he begin to grasp it wasn't that he was forbidden to live, it was that no one needed him to exist. He sat in a cheap cafe at the edge of an industrial zone, watching plastic name-tagged men come and go. Each had a chair, a uniform, and a roll. One got up to use the restroom and left his phone and wallet on the table. A level of trust Rick used to mock as naive, now a luxury so distant he didn't dare sit too long for fear of looking like a drifter. All he had left was his name, printed on the sheet he once thought was a correction. But in the end, it was merely a confession. I learned nothing. When a young boy in an apron approached and whispered, "Sir, you've been sitting here a while. Would you like to order anything else?" Rick couldn't answer. Not because he had no money, but he had no idea what else to ask for. That evening, on the way home, Rick stopped by a small shop, once the bar where he drank with fellow officers after their shifts. Now, it was silent. The window glass was yellowed with old newspapers, the dim light reflecting his face like a smear from a man who no longer belonged to any generation. The owner glanced at him, said nothing, and turned away. A television in the corner replayed an old interview with Celeste. Rick turned his back to the screen, but her voice still reached his ears. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came to disarm the minds." A brief phrase, yet it thickened the bar's air, as if even the oxygen didn't want to let him breathe easily. The young bartender placed a glass on a different table without even glancing his way, not out of distraction, but because Rick's presence no longer required anyone to be polite. He left the place as rain began to fall, without an umbrella, without looking back. Each wet step felt like old paper sticking to the soles of his feet, unwanted, unneeded. Celeste, meanwhile, continued working as usual. No one mentioned the letter. She didn't ask. The name Rick Delaney appeared in no internal memos anymore. It existed only on a single sheet of paper, not as evidence, but as a blot of ink left after an attempt to erase. As for Rick, he still wrote. Not letters anymore, just fragments of journal entries, unread by anyone, a kind of scribbling only those who never learned how to make amends still bother with, as if, with enough words, enough pages, someone might forget who they were. But the truth is, he had already been defined, not by a sentence, but by the way people chose not to speak when he entered the room. And that was something he could never rewrite again. That morning, the sky was covered in a thin layer of mist, as if the city itself was still hesitating between something old and something new. A young officer stood before the glass door of the chief of police's office, holding an internal petition with nearly 100 signatures, requesting the launch of a new ethics retraining program. He looked at the gold-plated lettering that reflected his own shadow, Celeste Monroe, Chief of Police. The name did not resound like a symbol, but it carried more weight than any medal. Its presence was a quiet upheaval. No gunfire, no proclamations. Only a silent but unwavering existence. On professional forums where Rick's training documents once circulated, there now appeared countless analyses of the Monroe model, a strategy unnamed by its creator, yet attributed to her as a way for the community to reaffirm the moral authority of its leader. Final-year law students opened their theses with a short quote from her during the hearing. "Not everyone who has the right to decide should be the one making decisions," an old phrase, nothing novel, but when spoken by someone who had once been crushed by the system, it bore a weight that made people bold it, underline it, and share it. Internal affairs training programs quietly replaced one weekly session. Instead of subordinate communication procedures, it was now titled Silent Response, Lessons from the Monroe Dossier. The young officer took a breath, tapped lightly on the glass door, then gently pushed it open. The room was not large, but it was bright. The wall behind the desk displayed a map of the city, not framed in polished wood, but a plastic print with several zones circled in highlighter red. In the lower right corner of the map, a small yellow sticky note had been placed, bearing a handwritten line, "Start again from where they once ignored." No signature. No date, but the blurred ink proved it had been there, not to remind, but to persist, alongside resolve. Celeste looked up from a stack of documents. She neither smiled nor frowned, just gave a slight nod. The officer handed over the petition, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the full awareness of who stood before him. "We want to relearn from the beginning, not about power, but about its limits. His voice was not loud, but every syllable carried an honesty that could not be faked. Through the hallway's glass wall behind her, a few people paused, peering in, not out of curiosity, but to witness the moment a new brick was being laid on an old foundation. Celeste took it, scanned a few lines, then folded it. She offered no praise, showed no emotion. She opened the left drawer of her desk and placed the sheet inside. Alongside many other petitions, reports, and handwritten letters she had received in recent days. None were thrown away. But none were displayed as trophies either. On the drawer lid was a small, frayed piece of fabric. What remained, legible, read, "Keep only what you dare to face every day." A fragment of an old slogan from her cadet years. Now a guiding principle, not printed, not posted, not circulated, yet still the invisible backbone of her every decision. Every response from society was recorded, not to show off, but to clean up. On her desk was a brown leather notebook, hand-titled, "Things That Need Cleaning." No index, no page numbers. Every line was written in black ink, perfectly aligned. Beneath the title were 3 capitalized words, "Start from within." The young officer hesitated, then took one step back, nodding. "Yes, Chief." A short phrase, but it rang in the air like a form of recognition, not of position, but of presence. As he turned and walked away, Celeste's silhouette returned to its place on the glass door. No longer was the woman pulled by the arm in court. No longer the name mispronounced in the hallway. Now, she was someone with a proper name, and that name was etched on the door leading into the place where it is decided who gets to wear the uniform, and for what reason. Outside, the sun gradually emerged. The remnants of last night's rain had not fully dried, but pedestrians had begun to fill the sidewalks. A group of elementary students was led past the headquarters, and a few of them looked up at the glass door, whispering, "Who is she?" A teacher smiled and replied, "The one who keeps this city from losing its voice." Inside, Celeste was still at her desk, her left hand flipped through files, her right hand loosely holding a pen. Not writing. She glanced at the notebook's title once more, then placed the pen down and wrote one more line at the bottom. "Never allow someone like him to have another copy." No period, no underline, just one line, but enough to remind her, and anyone who sat in that chair after her, that not everyone deserves a second chance through the mercy of time. Some must be stopped. The clock read 8:17 a.m. A workday had begun, but this time it began under a name not Rick's, but hers. Celeste Monroe, engraved in gold, on glass, not for decoration, but so that no one forgets. The story of Celeste is not just the journey of a woman confronting injustice. It is a mirror for the millions who have been overlooked, dismissed in the halls bearing the name justice but lacking human dignity. Perhaps you've met a version of Rick. Perhaps you've been silenced in a crowd simply because of what you represent. Leave a comment, share what you've lived through, so no one has to walk alone in the dark. Don't forget to like this video if you felt the strength in this storyline. Share it so more people can feel the power of justice and dignity. Subscribe to the channel to let us know you're here. That, what we tell, still reaches real hearts. Every story, every interaction is a new heartbeat, and you are the one keeping that beat alive.